They tried to destroy the evidence. They burned files. They dynamited crematoria. They ordered forced evacuations and death marches. Across occupied Europe, as the Red Army advanced, the Nazis worked desperately to erase the machinery of murder. But at Majdanek they failed. On the outskirts of Lublin, in plain sight of the city, stood a vast complex of barbed wire, watchtowers, gas chambers, barracks, and crematoria. It was not hidden deep in forests like Treblinka. It was not dismantled as efficiently as Belzec. When Soviet forces arrived in July 1944, they found Majdanek largely intact. Warehouses filled with shoes, clothing, and personal belongings. Gas chambers still standing. Crematoria still bearing traces of ash. Majdanek became one of the first major Nazi concentration and extermination camps liberated by Allied forces. And because it was captured so quickly, so unexpectedly, it became one of the clearest windows into how the Holocaust truly functioned. But Majdanek was more than a failed cover-up. It was a hybrid camp, a place of forced labor, starvation, disease, execution, and mass gassing. Prisoners were worked for the German war effort while others were murdered in gas chambers using Zyklon B and carbon monoxide. It was both a concentration camp and a killing center. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Camp in Plain Sight. Majdanek did not begin as a symbol of genocide. It began as a plan, drafted on paper, calculated in numbers, and justified through ideology. In the summer of 1941, after Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union, the Nazi leadership faced a problem they had already anticipated: what to do with the growing masses of prisoners and populations they now controlled in the East. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Entire regions of Poland were already under brutal occupation. The SS envisioned a network of camps that would serve multiple purposes: detention, forced labor, exploitation, and elimination. Near the city of Lublin, in occupied Poland, Heinrich Himmler ordered the construction of a new camp. Its location was deliberate, close to rail lines, close to industrial and agricultural zones, close enough to Lublin that smoke from crematoria would later be visible from nearby neighborhoods. This was not a hidden forest installation. Majdanek rose on open fields, its barracks stretching across flat land that had once been farmland. Civilians in Lublin could see it. Some could hear it. The camp existed not beyond society, but alongside it. Construction began in October 1941. At first, the camp was intended to hold Soviet prisoners of war. Conditions were catastrophic from the beginning. Thousands of Soviet POWs were forced to build the camp itself, erecting barracks, digging ditches, laying fences, installing watchtowers. They worked in freezing temperatures with inadequate clothing and almost no food. Disease spread quickly. By the winter of 1941–42, many of those original prisoners were already dead. Majdanek's foundation was laid by men who would not survive to see the structure completed. The camp expanded rapidly. Plans projected tens of thousands of prisoners. Barracks multiplied. Barbed wire enclosed larger sections. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, creating a grid of surveillance. The camp was divided into fields, sections that separated prisoners by category. Political prisoners, Jews, Soviet POWs, women, children, each group marked, classified, processed. Majdanek was not designed initially as a single-purpose extermination center like Treblinka or Sobibor. It functioned as a concentration camp, a labor camp, and eventually a killing center. That hybrid nature made it both complex and deadly. Prisoners could be exploited for work in nearby factories or farms. Others were deemed unfit and selected for execution. Disease itself became a weapon. Overcrowding, malnutrition, and exposure did what bullets sometimes did not. The bureaucracy that governed Majdanek operated with chilling efficiency. Registration numbers replaced names. Personal belongings were catalogued. Confiscated property was sorted and shipped into the German economy. Shoes, coats, gold teeth, hair, nothing was considered waste. The system turned human existence into inventory. Daily life inside Majdanek followed rigid schedules. Roll calls at dawn, labor assignments, meager rations of watery soup and small pieces of bread. Punishments for minor infractions. Beatings were routine. Public executions were staged as warnings. The presence of the SS was constant. Uniforms, dogs, shouted orders, arbitrary violence. Prisoners learned quickly that survival depended on silence, obedience, and luck. By 1942, Majdanek's function began to shift. As Operation Reinhard intensified and the extermination of Polish Jewry accelerated, the camp incorporated gas chambers into its structure. Unlike camps that relied solely on deception and rapid killing, Majdanek integrated mass murder into an already functioning labor complex. Prisoners arriving by transport might be selected for work or directed toward chambers disguised as showers. Zyklon B pellets were used in some of these chambers, linking Majdanek to the broader industrialized killing methods of the Holocaust. Yet what made Majdanek historically unique was not only its brutality, but its visibility. Smoke from crematoria drifted over nearby roads. Prisoner columns marched under guard through areas not far from civilian populations. Supply trucks moved in and out. The camp was part of a functioning regional infrastructure. The boundary between camp and city was physical, fences and wire, but not geographic distance. As the prisoner population grew, so did mortality. Typhus outbreaks ravaged overcrowded barracks. Medical facilities were insufficient and often cruel. Prisoners too weak to work were sometimes sent to be killed. The camp became both a site of attrition and direct execution. Survival rates fluctuated, but suffering was constant. Majdanek's administration mirrored the wider SS system. Commandants enforced policy handed down from Berlin. Guards followed routines that blended procedure with cruelty. Clerks maintained records that tracked labor output, prisoner numbers, and death statistics. The paperwork was meticulous. Death certificates were sometimes falsified to conceal executions. Language disguised violence. Special treatment. Evacuation. Transfer. Words replaced bullets on official documents. By late 1942 and into 1943, Majdanek stood as a central node in the Nazi camp network of occupied Poland. It was connected to forced labor industries. It intersected with extermination policies. It processed thousands of human lives through gates that many would never leave. But history would take an unexpected turn. Unlike other death camps that were dismantled before Allied forces arrived, Majdanek would soon become one of the first major camps captured largely intact. And when liberation came, it would expose not rumor, not testimony alone, but physical proof. Before that moment, however, the camp still functioned as designed. Work, selection, punishment, death. Majdanek did not operate in secrecy. It operated in plain sight, under a regime confident that its system would never be judged. In the next segment, we move deeper into the transformation of Majdanek, from a labor and POW camp into a fully integrated killing center, and the escalation of mass murder that followed. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Expansion, Selection, and the Machinery of Death. By early 1942, Majdanek was no longer simply a camp for Soviet prisoners of war. The war in the East had intensified, and Nazi racial policy was evolving into systematic extermination. What had begun as imprisonment and forced labor was now merging with a broader genocidal plan. The camp's population shifted. Jewish deportees from across occupied Poland began arriving in increasing numbers. Political prisoners, resistance suspects, and civilians caught in mass roundups followed. Majdanek's role expanded, not by public declaration, but by quiet administrative orders and construction changes that altered its purpose forever. Transports arrived by rail, often after days of travel in sealed cattle cars. Inside, men, women, and children stood packed together with little water and no sanitation. When the doors opened at Majdanek's unloading ramp, confusion followed. Shouted commands in German, SS guards with dogs, prisoners forced into lines. The first process was selection, a decision made in seconds that determined who would work and who would die. Those judged fit for labor were registered. Heads were shaved, clothes confiscated, numbers assigned. Those considered unfit, the elderly, the sick, many children were separated. At first, executions occurred by shooting or other direct methods. But by mid-1942, gas chambers had been installed within the camp complex. These chambers were constructed inside brick buildings, concealed within the infrastructure of daily operations. Some victims were told they were going to showers for disinfection. Others were given no explanation at all. Zyklon B pellets were introduced into sealed rooms. Carbon monoxide gas was also used in certain instances. The killing process was methodical. Afterward, Sonderkommando prisoners, themselves captives forced into this role, removed bodies. Gold teeth were extracted. Hair was cut. Belongings were sorted. The dead were transported to crematoria or burial pits. Smoke became a familiar sight. Majdanek's hybrid structure made it different from extermination centers designed solely for immediate death. Prisoners lived and died within the same space. Labor details worked near killing facilities. Barracks stood within sight of execution grounds. The boundary between survival and annihilation was fragile and constantly shifting. Forced labor intensified as Germany's war economy demanded more output. Prisoners were sent to workshops producing uniforms, boots, and military equipment. Others worked in nearby agricultural estates or construction projects. Long hours, minimal rations, and physical abuse defined the routine. Productivity determined survival. Weakness invited punishment. Food rations rarely met basic caloric needs. Watery soup made from turnips or cabbage, a small portion of bread, sometimes margarine or a scrap of sausage. Hunger hollowed faces and reduced bodies to bone. Disease followed quickly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Infections spread easily through overcrowded barracks with limited sanitation. Medical care within the camp was deeply compromised. The infirmary, known as the Revier, sometimes provided minimal assistance. At other times, it functioned as a place of selection. Prisoners too ill to return to work were marked. Some were transferred directly to gas chambers under administrative language that described the action as relocation. Punishments reinforced fear. Public hangings were staged before assembled prisoners. Beatings occurred for minor infractions, standing incorrectly at roll call, failing to meet quotas, speaking without permission. Solitary confinement cells housed those accused of sabotage or resistance. The goal was not merely physical control, but psychological domination. Majdanek's administration maintained detailed records. Transport lists documented arrivals. Work assignments were logged. Deaths were recorded with causes that often concealed reality. A prisoner executed by gas might be listed as having died of pneumonia or heart failure. Bureaucracy masked murder beneath layers of paper. In November 1943, Majdanek became the site of one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust. Operation Erntefest, meaning Harvest Festival, was carried out by SS units across the Lublin district. Jewish prisoners from Majdanek and nearby camps were assembled in large groups. On November 3rd and 4th, thousands were marched to prepared trenches and shot. Music played from loudspeakers to drown out the sound of gunfire. Over 18,000 people were murdered at Majdanek in 2 days. It was one of the deadliest shooting operations of the entire genocide. After Erntefest, Majdanek's Jewish population was drastically reduced. The camp continued functioning, but its character shifted again. Non-Jewish prisoners, political detainees, and others remained. Forced labor persisted. Executions did not stop. The machinery of death adapted rather than ceased. Despite mass killings, daily routines continued. Roll calls lasted for hours in freezing weather. Prisoners stood motionless as guards counted and recounted numbers. If totals did not match records, entire groups were punished. Even the dead had to be accounted for before removal. Outside the fences, the war began to turn against Germany. By 1944, Soviet forces advanced westward. Rumors filtered into the camp, whispered stories of retreating German armies. Yet inside Majdanek, brutality did not lessen. Transports still arrived. Prisoners still worked. Death still occurred. Unlike camps that were dismantled ahead of approaching armies, Majdanek's evacuation was incomplete. The speed of the Soviet advance caught the SS unprepared. Some prisoners were marched westward in hurried evacuations. Others were left behind. Guards destroyed certain documents. Crematoria were damaged in attempts to conceal evidence. But the scale of the camp made total erasure impossible. Majdanek's transformation from POW camp to extermination and labor complex reveals how fluid Nazi policy could be. The camp evolved with ideological directives and military needs. Killing methods were adjusted. Labor priorities shifted. But the underlying principle remained consistent. Human life was expendable in service of the Reich. In the next segment, we examine the final phase before liberation, the attempted concealment, the prisoners left behind, and the moment when Majdanek became one of the first major camps discovered almost intact, exposing undeniable proof of the system that had operated there. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Liberation, Evidence, and the camp the Nazis could not erase. By the summer of 1944, the war that had once seemed unstoppable to Nazi leadership was collapsing inward. The Red Army pushed steadily west after the success of Operation Bagration. Entire German army groups disintegrated across Eastern Europe. Supply lines fractured. Communications faltered. And in the Lublin district of occupied Poland, Soviet forces moved faster than the SS expected. Majdanek, vast, exposed, and still active, suddenly stood in the path of advancing troops. Unlike other camps that were dismantled months in advance, Majdanek did not receive enough warning for systematic destruction. Some evacuation orders were issued. Prisoners capable of walking were forced onto westbound transports or death marches toward camps deeper inside Germany. But the evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. Thousands remained. Records were partially burned. Certain buildings were damaged. Crematoria ovens were sabotaged in an attempt to render them unusable. Yet time ran out. On July 23, 1944, Soviet soldiers entered Majdanek. They did not find an abandoned shell stripped of evidence. They found barracks still standing, watchtowers intact, warehouses filled with confiscated belongings, shoes, clothing, suitcases, children's toys, gas chambers with traces of chemical residue, crematoria with ash still visible. The physical infrastructure of extermination lay before them, largely preserved. For the first time in the war, a major concentration and extermination complex had been captured almost intact. The soldiers encountered prisoners too weak to leave. Some were skeletal, barely able to stand. Others were ill with typhus or dysentery. Many stared in silence, uncertain whether liberation was real or another deception. The gates had opened, but survival was not immediate. Disease and starvation still threatened lives in the days that followed. Medical units attempted emergency care. Food was distributed carefully to prevent fatal refeeding shock. Barracks were inspected. The scale of death was difficult to comprehend even for seasoned soldiers who had seen combat across devastated landscapes. Mass graves were discovered on the grounds. Trenches where Operation Erntefest had taken place were identified. Soil was disturbed. Evidence of hurried burials and burning attempts could be seen in the earth itself. Photographs were taken. Journalists were invited. Soviet authorities quickly recognized the significance of what had been uncovered. Majdanek became one of the earliest concrete proofs presented to the world of industrialized mass murder. In August 1944, only weeks after liberation, a formal investigation commission began documenting the camp. Chemical analysis confirmed the use of Zyklon B in gas chambers. Witness testimonies from survivors described selection procedures, forced labor, executions, and daily conditions. Physical evidence, crematoria, gas chamber walls stained blue by cyanide residue, piles of personal belongings, provided material confirmation. Unlike later discoveries at Auschwitz or other camps in 1945, Majdanek's liberation occurred while the war still raged. Skepticism initially met Soviet reports in some Western circles. The scale seemed almost unbelievable. Yet as Allied forces advanced and uncovered additional camps, Majdanek's evidence was validated and reinforced. The Nazis had intended Majdanek to function as part of a hidden machinery of extermination. Instead, it became one of the first camps where the machinery itself was exposed to the world. For the survivors, liberation marked the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another. Families had been destroyed, homes erased, entire communities eliminated. Many prisoners had no country to return to. Some were transferred to hospitals. Others wandered through liberated territories seeking relatives who would never answer. The campgrounds did not immediately fall silent. Investigators continued their work. Evidence was catalogued. Buildings were preserved as proof. The scale of property confiscation alone revealed the magnitude of deportations. Warehouses held thousands of shoes, evidence not of relocation, but of systematic stripping of identity before death. The term, the camp the Nazis failed to hide, emerged because Majdanek contradicted their broader strategy of concealment. In camps like Treblinka and Sobibor, structures were dismantled and grounds disguised. At Majdanek, speed prevented thorough erasure. The infrastructure of murder remained visible. As the war ended in 1945, Majdanek's documentation played a role in early war crimes proceedings. Testimonies from survivors and captured personnel contributed to understanding how extermination was organized not only in isolated camps, but as part of a coordinated system. Majdanek revealed several critical truths. First, extermination did not require secrecy at every stage. It operated within bureaucratic frameworks, recorded on transport lists and supply orders. Second, forced labor and killing functioned side by side. A camp could produce military goods in the morning and execute prisoners in the afternoon. Third, genocide was not a spontaneous eruption of violence, but an engineered process sustained by administration, logistics, and obedience. The physical preservation of Majdanek forced the world to confront these realities sooner than expected. Even after liberation, the site remained a place of mourning. Families searched for names in incomplete records. Survivors revisited barracks in later years, tracing the spaces where they had stood for roll call or labored under guard. Memorialization efforts began in post-war Poland, ensuring the grounds would remain as testimony rather than vanish into redevelopment. Majdanek stands today not only as a memorial but as evidence, a reminder that systems of mass murder can operate behind ordinary fences and under bureaucratic language. Its relative intactness provides historians with rare insight into camp design, daily function, and extermination methods. The story of Majdanek's first chapter is not only about its construction or expansion. It is about exposure. It is about a system that tried to erase its own traces and failed. In the next chapter, we step backward in time, before liberation, before extermination, to examine how Majdanek was conceived in the first place. Who ordered its creation? Why was it built near Lublin? And how did ideological vision turn into physical structures on open fields? To understand how Majdanek operated, we must first understand how it began. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Planning the Camp, Ideology, Expansion, and the Birth of Majdanek. Majdanek did not appear suddenly on the outskirts of Lublin. It was conceived within a broader vision that had already begun reshaping occupied Poland into a laboratory of Nazi racial policy, and to understand its creation we must return to the months after Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, when the region known as the General Government became a testing ground for demographic engineering, forced labor, and long-term plans of colonization. Heinrich Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, was not merely overseeing security operations. He was directing a radical restructuring of Eastern Europe based on racial hierarchy. Millions of Poles and Jews were to be displaced, enslaved, or eliminated. In this vision, camps were not accidental byproducts of war but instruments of transformation. By 1941, as Operation Barbarossa launched Germany into a vast invasion of the Soviet Union, the scale of imprisonment expanded dramatically. Soviet prisoners of war were captured in the millions. Jewish communities were confined into ghettos, awaiting an undefined solution. The SS required new facilities, large, adaptable, expandable, capable of housing forced laborers, political prisoners, and eventually those marked for extermination. It was within this climate of expansion and ideological certainty that the decision to build a new camp near Lublin took shape. The chosen location was practical and symbolic. Lublin lay at a crossroads of rail lines connecting Warsaw, Krakow, and the Eastern Front. It was close to Jewish population centers and to future extermination sites that would emerge under Operation Reinhard. The open fields southeast of the city provided space for rapid construction. There were no mountains or forests to conceal it. Majdanek would stand visible against the horizon, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, a fixed installation in the machinery of occupation. Initially, in late 1941, plans described the camp as a prisoner-of-war facility, intended primarily for Soviet captives. The scale envisioned was enormous. Capacity estimates ranged from 25,000 to even 50,000 inmates, with projections fluctuating as the war's demands shifted. The early blueprints reveal a rigid, geometric layout divided into fields, each containing rows of barracks aligned for surveillance and control. Administrative buildings, guard towers, storage warehouses, workshops, and service structures were mapped with bureaucratic precision. The design reflected lessons learned from earlier camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen, but on a broader scale, integrating forced labor potential from the outset. Construction began under harsh conditions. Ironically, some of the earliest prisoners forced to build Majdanek were Soviet POWs themselves, starving and exposed to winter cold as they erected fences and barracks that would later confine others. Mortality was immediate and staggering. Many died before the camp was fully operational. Their deaths were not seen as failures of planning but as expendable losses within a racial war framed as existential. By early 1942, policy began shifting more decisively toward systematic extermination. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 formalized the coordination of what officials termed the final solution, though killing operations had already begun in occupied territories. Majdanek's role evolved accordingly. While originally conceptualized as a labor and POW camp, it became integrated into the network of camps facilitating both exploitation and mass murder. Gas chambers were constructed within its perimeter. Crematoria were added to handle the bodies. Administrative offices recorded transports, labor assignments, confiscated property, and death counts with cold efficiency. Unlike pure extermination sites such as Treblinka, Majdanek combined multiple functions: detention, forced labor, and killing within a single expanding complex. Its location near Lublin also connected it to Operation Reinhardt headquarters, from which deportations across the general government were organized. Trains carrying Jews from ghettos in Poland and beyond passed through the region. Some were directed to extermination camps. Others arrived at Majdanek, where selections determined who would be worked, who would be imprisoned temporarily, and who would be killed immediately. The bureaucratic language surrounding the camp concealed its true nature. Orders referenced special treatment, resettlement, and labor deployment. Yet behind these phrases lay a systematic process rooted in ideology. The belief that entire populations were biologically inferior and disposable. The planning of Majdanek illustrates how genocide does not erupt spontaneously but is engineered through meetings, memoranda, supply lists, and construction contracts. Barbed wire had to be ordered. Timber had to be cut. Guard rotations scheduled. Zyklon B delivered. Each logistical step was part of a larger system in which individual participants could claim they were fulfilling administrative duties rather than participating in murder. As 1942 progressed, the camp expanded beyond its original boundaries. Additional prisoner fields were added. Subcamps developed in surrounding areas to supply labor to agricultural estates and industrial projects. Majdanek's dual identity, as a labor reservoir and a killing site, became firmly established. Its proximity to civilian areas did not prevent operations. Instead, it normalized them. Smoke rising from crematoria could be seen from nearby roads. Prisoner columns marched under guard within sight of local inhabitants. The camp existed both hidden and visible, operating through a mixture of fear, propaganda, and imposed silence. In examining Majdanek's planning phase, we see the convergence of ideology and infrastructure. It was not chaos that produced the camp, but deliberate strategy shaped by racial doctrine and wartime expansion. The decision to build Majdanek reveals how the Nazi regime translated abstract hatred into physical architecture. Fences marked exclusion. Barracks institutionalized control. Gas chambers mechanized death. And all of it began not with gunfire, but with documents signed in offices, lines drawn on maps, and a conviction that certain lives could be measured only in labor value or eliminated entirely. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Expansion, Labor, and the Camp becomes a system. As 1942 unfolded and the war in the East intensified, Majdanek did not remain a static installation on the outskirts of Lublin. It evolved rapidly, absorbing new functions, new prisoner categories, and new layers of administrative complexity until it resembled not a single camp but a self-contained system of control. The early months had already revealed catastrophic mortality among Soviet prisoners of war, many of whom perished from starvation, exposure, and disease before permanent structures were even completed. Yet instead of prompting reconsideration, these losses reinforced the regime's belief that prisoners were expendable. The camp's leadership shifted focus toward integrating Majdanek into the broader SS economic apparatus, particularly as Germany's war economy demanded increasing labor to replace men sent to the front. Forced labor became central to the camp's identity. Prisoners were assigned to construction details, agricultural projects, workshops, and storage depots. Warehouses filled with confiscated property from deported Jews, clothing, shoes, household goods, were sorted and catalogued for redistribution within the Reich. The process was systematic. Items were disinfected, repaired, bundled, and shipped, turning theft into organized supply. Within this bureaucratic routine, suffering became normalized. Prisoners worked long hours under constant surveillance, their physical strength calculated against productivity targets. Food rations were minimal, often consisting of thin soup and small portions of bread. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making disease inevitable. Typhus outbreaks spread through overcrowded barracks, compounding death rates. The camp's layout expanded into distinct prisoner fields separated by electrified fences, each with its own internal hierarchy and guard rotations. Administrative offices recorded arrivals and departures with meticulous care. Transport lists detailed numbers, ages, and categories. Some prisoners were designated as political, others as Jews, Soviet POWs, or criminals, labels that determined treatment and survival probability. The classification system fragmented solidarity and reinforced SS control. Capos, prisoners appointed as overseers, were used to enforce discipline within work details, creating a layered structure in which coercion flowed downward. Majdanek's growth mirrored broader developments in the Nazi camp network. It was increasingly linked to Operation Reinhard, the campaign to exterminate Jews in the general government. While camps like Treblinka and Sobibor functioned primarily as killing centers, Majdanek combined detention and murder. Gas chambers, initially used sporadically, became more integrated into operations. Zyklon B and carbon monoxide were employed against selected groups deemed unfit for labor. The crematorium infrastructure expanded accordingly. Bodies were burned to reduce visible evidence and manage the scale of death. Yet, even with these measures, mortality from starvation and disease often outpaced killing operations. The camp's population fluctuated dramatically as transports arrived from across occupied Europe. Jews from Polish ghettos, deportees from Slovakia, the Netherlands, and other regions, and political prisoners from various territories were all funneled through Majdanek. Some were redistributed to sub-camps or labor sites. Others were killed shortly after arrival. The constant movement created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Prisoners could not predict whether they would be assigned to work details, confined indefinitely, or selected for execution. This unpredictability was itself a mechanism of terror. Majdanek's integration into the SS economic system deepened as the war strained German industry. Workshops within the camp repaired military equipment, produced uniforms, and supported supply chains. Agricultural estates attached to the camp used prisoner labor to cultivate crops for the German military. In official correspondence, the language emphasized efficiency and output, rarely acknowledging the human cost. Reports measured productivity in quotas and hours, not in lives diminished. The camp command structure operated within a clear chain of authority. Orders flowed from higher SS leadership through camp commandants to administrative officers and guards. Regular inspections ensured compliance with regulations governing labor, punishment, and reporting. Punishments were codified. Flogging, confinement in standing cells, and execution for alleged infractions were part of a regulated system designed to reinforce discipline. Public executions served as warnings. The spectacle of punishment was intended to suppress resistance and maintain order within overcrowded conditions. Yet beneath the surface of control, cracks appeared. Overcrowding strained infrastructure. Sanitation systems failed under pressure. Food supplies were inconsistent. As more transports arrived, barracks meant for a few hundred held far greater numbers. The resulting disease and mortality threatened to disrupt labor output, revealing a tension within the system. The desire to exploit prisoners economically while simultaneously degrading them to the point of collapse. This contradiction was inherent in the ideology driving the camp. Prisoners were seen as racially inferior and expendable, yet their labor was essential to the war effort. Majdanek thus embodied a grim calculus in which bodies were consumed at a rate deemed acceptable so long as productivity continued. The expansion phase of 1942 to 1943 transformed Majdanek from a planned detention facility into a central node within the machinery of occupation and genocide. It demonstrated how camps adapted to shifting wartime priorities without abandoning their ideological core. Labor and killing were not opposing functions but complementary tools within a single system. By the time Majdanek reached its operational peak, it stood as both workplace and graveyard, warehouse and crematorium, administrative office and execution site. The evolution was not chaotic. It was incremental and methodical, driven by memoranda, construction schedules, and economic calculations. In this transformation, we see how the camp ceased to be merely a place and became a process, an organized mechanism through which exploitation, terror, and death were administered side by side, day after day, under the watchful eyes of guards and the silent columns of smoke rising into the sky above Lublin. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Selections, Extermination, and the Machinery Revealed. By late 1942 and into 1943, Majdanek had fully crossed the threshold from a brutal detention and labor complex into an integrated site of systematic extermination, where the logic of selection governed life and death with bureaucratic precision, and where the boundaries between labor camp and killing center dissolved almost entirely. Transports arriving at the camp were no longer simply processed for registration and work assignment but subjected to increasingly decisive sorting procedures in which SS doctors and officers evaluated prisoners within moments of arrival, determining who might temporarily sustain labor and who would be eliminated immediately, a process carried out not in chaotic frenzy but with administrative routine, clipboards in hand, columns of numbers recorded, bodies reduced to categories that translated directly into fate. Those deemed unfit, because of age, illness, exhaustion, or simply overcrowding quotas, were separated under pretexts of delousing or transfer, directed toward facilities whose outward appearance suggested sanitation but whose sealed doors concealed gas chambers equipped to use carbon monoxide and later Zyklon B. The mechanics of killing were calibrated to efficiency, ventilation systems installed, crematoria expanded, and burial pits dug when incineration capacity lagged behind the volume of death, all coordinated with timetables that aligned transport arrivals, processing, and disposal so that disruption remained minimal and secrecy was maintained not through invisibility but through normalization. Prisoners inside the camp understood gradually, through rumor and observation, that disappearance often followed selection, that columns led away at dusk did not return, that smoke from the crematorium chimneys signaled not industrial output but the erasure of human existence. Yet open resistance was nearly impossible in a space structured for surveillance, where guard towers overlooked every barrack, electrified fences defined perimeters, and internal prisoner hierarchies reinforced discipline. Through coercion, Majdanek's role within Operation Reinhard intensified during this period, particularly in the context of the mass shootings that culminated in Operation Harvest Festival in November 1943, when thousands of Jewish prisoners from Majdanek and nearby labor camps were executed in coordinated actions designed to eliminate remaining Jewish forced laborers in the Lublin district. Trenches were prepared under the guise of construction. Loudspeakers broadcast music to drown out gunfire, and firing squads worked methodically for hours, transforming fields into killing grounds in one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust, an event that revealed the extent to which the camp functioned not merely as a site of containment but as an instrument of deliberate, large-scale annihilation. The administrative language surrounding these operations remained chillingly detached, framed in memoranda as security measures or anti-partisan actions, while the lived reality was one of orchestrated slaughter, bodies falling in layers, earth moving to conceal evidence even as new graves were required. Within the camp proper, daily routines continued almost unchanged. Roll calls at dawn, work details dispatched, soup ladled in thin portions, demonstrating how the machinery of terror operated in parallel tracks, ordinary labor exploitation proceeding alongside extraordinary episodes of mass execution without contradiction in the minds of those enforcing the system. Disease outbreaks compounded mortality, especially typhus, which thrived in overcrowded barracks where lice spread unchecked, and though the SS periodically implemented quarantine measures, these were driven less by concern for prisoner welfare than by fear of contagion reaching guards or disrupting labor output. Medical facilities inside the camp offered minimal treatment, often serving instead as holding spaces for those too weak to work and therefore vulnerable to selection, reinforcing the brutal calculus that equated productivity with temporary survival. Meanwhile, warehouses within Majdanek processed mountains of confiscated property from murdered Jews, clothing sorted by size, gold teeth extracted, currency counted and redirected, illustrating how extermination was intertwined with economic exploitation, how death fed supply chains and personal enrichment, and how every stage of the process, from arrival to disposal, was documented in ledgers that rendered atrocity into columns of figures. As the Eastern Front shifted and Soviet forces advanced westward in 1944, Majdanek's administrators faced a new imperative: concealment. Yet unlike camps deeper within occupied Poland, Majdanek's proximity to the front limited the time available for systematic destruction of evidence. And although attempts were made to dismantle installations, burn documents, and evacuate prisoners, the rapid Soviet advance in July 1944 resulted in the camp being captured largely intact, making it one of the first major concentration camps liberated and revealing to the world a physical record of gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses, and mass graves that the Nazis had failed to erase. This abrupt exposure shattered any illusion that such camps were merely detention centers exaggerated by rumor. Instead, it provided tangible proof of a coordinated system of murder and exploitation operating under official authority, with infrastructure designed not for temporary repression but for sustained annihilation. Chapter 2 closes at this critical juncture, where Majdanek stands fully revealed as a dual instrument of forced labor and extermination, its fields scarred by mass shootings, its barracks thinned by starvation and disease, its administrative offices testament to how ordinary bureaucratic mechanisms facilitated extraordinary crimes. The camp's transformation from detention site to killing complex was not a sudden rupture but a gradual intensification, each step justified within the regime's ideological framework, each expansion recorded and approved, until the machinery functioned with grim regularity, turning arrivals into numbers, numbers into ashes, and ashes into silence, until the front lines reached its gates and the system, for the first time, faced the consequence of being seen. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Life inside Majdanek. Survival under a system of exhaustion. Life inside Majdanek did not move in dramatic moments but in grinding repetition, a rhythm of hunger, labor, fear, and waiting that wore prisoners down day after day until survival itself became an act measured not in hope but in endurance. And in this chapter we step beyond the structures of gas chambers and crematoria to examine the daily reality of those who remained alive within the barbed wire, those who rose each morning not knowing whether they would still be counted by nightfall. Before dawn, the camp siren pierced the darkness, summoning thousands from wooden barracks that offered little insulation against the damp cold of eastern Poland, and men and women struggled upright from triple-tiered bunks packed so tightly that turning over in sleep required coordination. The air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, disease, and decay, while capos, prisoner functionaries appointed by the SS, shouted commands to hurry, often striking those too slow to respond. Roll call or appel could last for hours regardless of weather, prisoners forced to stand motionless while guards counted and recounted figures that needed to match administrative records. If numbers failed to align, the entire formation endured extended punishment, reinforcing the principle that collective suffering maintained order more efficiently than individual discipline. Food followed, if it could be called that. A ladle of watery soup, sometimes flavored faintly with turnip or cabbage, and a ration of coarse bread meant to sustain a body assigned to heavy labor, calories far below the energy expended in quarries, workshops, and construction sites, creating a cycle in which malnutrition weakened muscles, slowed movement, invited beatings, and made selection for death more likely. Work details marched through the gates under armed supervision, some assigned to the camp's internal functions, repairing fences, maintaining crematoria, sorting confiscated property. Others sent to nearby factories or agricultural fields, all contributing to the German war economy in ways that tied their survival directly to productivity. Yet productivity itself became impossible as starvation deepened. The ideology of destruction through labor meant that exhaustion was not accidental but inherent to the system, and prisoners learned to ration their movements, to conserve strength in subtle ways, to trade small favors for scraps of food or extra moments of rest. Disease spread relentlessly in such conditions, especially typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, infections thriving where sanitation collapsed and clean water was scarce, and the infirmary, ostensibly a hospital, often functioned as a holding space where the sick waited either for minimal treatment or for transport to execution, its whitewashed walls unable to conceal the reality that medicine existed primarily to preserve labor capacity rather than human life. Psychological survival required adaptation as much as physical endurance. Prisoners formed fragile networks of solidarity, sharing crumbs of bread, exchanging information about rumors of frontline movements, whispering names of loved ones to keep memory alive, while others withdrew inward, conserving emotional energy as fiercely as calories, understanding that despair could accelerate decline as surely as hunger. The camp's internal hierarchy intensified tension. Capos wielded authority granted by the SS, sometimes exploiting fellow prisoners to maintain favor and better rations, other times attempting quiet acts of protection, creating moral landscapes shaped by coercion and survival instinct rather than clear lines of heroism or villainy. Public punishments reinforced terror. Floggings carried out before assembled blocks, prisoners forced to watch as deterrent, executions staged near roll call areas, ensuring that fear remained constant, a background presence that shaped every interaction. Yet even in such conditions, moments of resistance flickered, subtle and often invisible, a hidden prayer murmured at night, a document concealed instead of delivered, a tool misaligned to slow production, acts small enough to escape detection, but meaningful enough to assert a fragment of autonomy. Majdanek's proximity to Lublin meant that local civilians occasionally glimpsed columns of prisoners or smelled smoke from the crematoria, and this visibility added another dimension to life inside. The knowledge that the outside world existed only meters away yet remained inaccessible, a reminder of isolation that deepened psychological strain. Seasons altered the texture of suffering. Summer heat thickened the stench of decay and accelerated disease. Winter froze mud into ice that cracked under wooden clogs, turning marches to work sites into hazards where a fall might invite a rifle butt or worse. Yet the calendar mattered less than the routine, which blurred days into indistinguishable stretches of labor and fatigue. Prisoners marked time not by dates but by rumors. Whispers of Soviet advances, reports of Allied landings in the West, faint signals that the regime might one day collapse, though each rumor carried risk, as hope could be dangerous if it inspired reckless action. Children, when present in the camp, faced even harsher odds, their small bodies ill-suited to forced labor, often hidden by adult prisoners when possible, smuggled into lighter tasks, protected through collective effort that demonstrated how solidarity persisted even under systemic dehumanization. And through all of this, the camp administration maintained its bureaucratic routines. Files updated, labor quotas calculated, transport lists prepared, illustrating the chilling coexistence of paperwork and pain, how ordinary administrative language framed extraordinary cruelty as procedure. Chapter 3 begins here, within the lived experience of Majdanek's prisoners, not in singular moments of massacre but in the slow erosion of strength and identity, the daily confrontation with a system engineered to exhaust, intimidate, and erase, and yet unable to extinguish entirely the stubborn instinct to survive, to remember one's name, to look at another prisoner and recognize a fellow human being in a place designed to deny that recognition. In understanding this daily reality, we grasp how Majdanek functioned not only as a site of execution but as an environment of calculated attrition, where life was prolonged just long enough to extract value and then discarded when usefulness ended, a mechanism of control sustained by hunger, fear, and routine, and endured by those who clung to fragments of dignity amid the machinery of annihilation. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Selections, Fear, and the Mechanics of Elimination. Inside Majdanek, survival was never secure, because at any moment the fragile line between labor and death could vanish during what the camp administration called a selection, a process that transformed human beings into categories on a list, dividing those still deemed useful from those marked for immediate execution, and this mechanism, quiet administrative routine, became one of the most powerful instruments of terror within the camp. Unlike chaotic violence, selections followed a pattern. Announced with little warning, prisoners ordered to assemble, strip, or march past SS officers who observed them with clinical detachment, evaluating posture, weight, visible illness, and the ability to stand upright without assistance, while doctors in uniform reduced complex human lives to swift judgments based on perceived productivity. The criteria were not hidden. Weakness invited death, and yet weakness was inevitable in a system structured around starvation and overwork, creating a cruel paradox in which the very conditions imposed by the camp ensured eventual failure, making selections less about discipline and more about systematic attrition. Prisoners learned to anticipate these moments with dread, developing strategies to conceal illness. Pinching cheeks to add color, standing straighter despite dizziness, whispering to one another to exchange places if someone seemed too frail. But such efforts were temporary shields at best. The SS controlled the pace and scale, and when transports from other camps arrived, swelling the population, selections intensified, clearing barracks to restore what administrators considered order. Those chosen for death were often separated swiftly, marched under guard toward the gas chambers or execution pits, sometimes under the pretense of transfer, sometimes with brutal clarity, and the remaining prisoners watched, understanding that today's reprieve did not guarantee tomorrow's safety. The psychological weight of this constant uncertainty shaped daily life, because every cough could signal danger, every injury risked exposure, and even friendships carried risk if one companion's visible decline drew scrutiny. Solidarity existed, but it coexisted with fear, a tension that eroded trust while also strengthening bonds forged in shared vulnerability. Majdanek's gas chambers, located disturbingly close to living quarters, reinforced the proximity of death, their existence known to many prisoners through rumor, smell, or the sight of smoke rising from crematoria. Yet the camp did not rely solely on gassing. Shootings, hangings, and mass executions punctuated the calendar, especially during periods of heightened repression or retaliation for resistance beyond the wire, and public executions were staged deliberately to reinforce authority. Prisoners forced to stand in formation as bodies were displayed, transforming punishment into spectacle. Among the most devastating events were large-scale massacres carried out under Operation Reinhard, including the mass shooting known as Action Ernstfest in November 1943, when thousands of Jewish prisoners in the Lublin district were executed in coordinated actions designed to eliminate remaining labor forces deemed unnecessary or dangerous, and at Majdanek alone the sound of gunfire echoed for hours as victims were forced into trenches and killed in waves, a grim culmination of policies that combined administrative planning with direct violence. For those who survived such days, memory became both burden and resistance, because witnessing meant carrying knowledge forward, and some prisoners quietly resolved to survive long enough to testify, to ensure that what happened in the fields and chambers would not dissolve into silence. The SS maintained meticulous records even as they orchestrated these killings, updating labor rosters, transport manifests, and execution reports, illustrating again how bureaucracy insulated perpetrators from the human reality of their actions. Paperwork framed mass murder as logistical necessity, and language such as special treatment obscured brutality behind euphemism, making violence appear procedural rather than moral. Selections also intersected with forced labor demands. When factories required more workers, the sick might be spared temporarily, transferred instead of killed, while during epidemics or overcrowding, liquidation accelerated, revealing that policy shifted according to economic calculus rather than consistent ideology alone. Prisoner functionaries navigated impossible choices during these moments, sometimes attempting to hide names, altering lists when possible, steering weaker inmates toward tasks perceived as safer, but such acts carried lethal risk if discovered, and not all functionaries resisted. Some complied strictly, protecting their own relative privilege within the hierarchy, reinforcing how the system exploited survival instinct to sustain itself. Children, elderly prisoners, and those visibly disabled faced almost certain selection, their vulnerability interpreted as inefficiency, and the emotional toll on adult prisoners who witnessed children separated from mothers or elders removed from barracks compounded trauma that words struggle to capture. Yet even here, fragments of humanity persisted, a blanket shared before departure, a whispered blessing, a final embrace that asserted dignity in defiance of dehumanization. Over time, the rhythm of selections reshaped perception of time itself, because weeks were measured by rumors of the next inspection, by the tension in the air before roll call, by the absence of familiar faces afterward, and barracks emptied and refilled with disorienting regularity, reinforcing the sense that life in Majdanek was provisional, contingent, perpetually evaluated. The approach of the Soviet Army in 1944 altered this dynamic slightly, as administrative focus shifted toward evacuation and concealment. Yet even in retreat, the machinery of elimination did not halt. Prisoners too weak to march were executed, evidence destroyed hastily, records burned or removed, but the memory of selections lingered among survivors as emblematic of how the camp functioned, not as spontaneous brutality but as structured, repeatable procedure. In understanding selections at Majdanek, we confront the core logic of the system. Human worth reduced to labor capacity, morality subordinated to policy, and death administered through routine, transforming the act of standing in line into a moment where life could end with a gesture of a gloved hand. And yet within that same line stood individuals who straightened their shoulders, who locked eyes with one another, who resisted inward collapse even when external resistance seemed impossible. This segment reveals how fear became infrastructure, how elimination operated not as chaos but as design, and how the prisoner's daily confrontation with selection shaped every aspect of existence inside Majdanek, turning survival into a temporary status granted by a regime that measured life in quotas and extinguished it with administrative precision, while those who endured carried forward the memory of each decision, each absence, each narrow escape, bearing witness to a system that functioned because it was organized, documented, and executed with deliberate intent. Chapter 3, Segment 3: Resistance, Rumors, and the Persistence of Memory. Even in a place designed to eliminate identity and reduce human beings to numbers, resistance did not vanish at Majdanek. It changed shape, moved quietly, and often survived in the smallest gestures rather than dramatic revolts, because open defiance invited immediate execution. Yet beneath the constant surveillance of guards and prisoner functionaries there emerged fragile networks of solidarity that defied the camp's central goal: to isolate, divide, and break the will. Resistance began with information, and information inside Majdanek was as valuable as food. Prisoners working in administrative offices sometimes glimpsed transport lists or labor assignments and passed warnings in whispers through barracks, alerting others to impending selections or deportations, allowing some to conceal themselves temporarily or alter work details. And though these efforts rarely saved many, they demonstrated that the system was not entirely seamless. Rumors also traveled of Soviet advances, of Allied landings in the West, of uprisings in other camps like Sobibor and Treblinka, and though such stories were often fragmented and uncertain, they provided psychological oxygen, a reminder that the world beyond the barbed wire still existed and that the regime was not invincible. For Jewish prisoners who understood Majdanek's connection to Operation Reinhard, rumors of rebellion elsewhere carried special weight, suggesting that even in extermination sites designed for absolute control, defiance could ignite. Resistance also took cultural forms. Secret prayers murmured in corners of barracks, fragments of poetry recited from memory, political discussions held in hushed tones after roll call, all acts that preserved intellectual and spiritual autonomy in an environment built to extinguish both. Maintaining a sense of identity became a radical act because the camp's bureaucracy sought to replace names with numbers and personal history with classification triangles sewn onto uniforms. Some prisoners formed clandestine committees organized by nationality or political affiliation, coordinating food distribution, sharing medical advice, and in rare cases planning sabotage in labor assignments, slowing production subtly or damaging equipment without drawing immediate suspicion, knowing that overt disruption would trigger collective punishment. Medical prisoners faced especially complex dilemmas, because doctors imprisoned alongside patients had limited supplies yet immense moral responsibility. Some falsified records to spare the weak from selections, others diluted reports to prevent immediate execution, navigating an ethical landscape shaped by coercion and scarcity, aware that discovery meant death not only for themselves but possibly for entire blocks. Resistance inside Majdanek never achieved the scale of armed revolt that occurred elsewhere, yet its quieter forms reveal the persistence of human agency under extreme repression, and they challenge the assumption that survival alone defined prisoner behavior. Many survivors later described a conscious decision to witness, to endure long enough to tell, framing survival itself as resistance against erasure. As 1944 progressed and the Soviet front drew closer to Lublin, tension among the SS intensified, and prisoners sensed the shift in atmosphere. Noticing hurried movements of documents, dismantling of equipment, and increased brutality as guards attempted to maintain authority in the face of impending defeat. In this unstable period, rumors of evacuation grew louder, and some prisoners prepared mentally for forced marches, recalling accounts from other camps where evacuations had become death. Marches across frozen landscapes. Within the camp, underground contacts with Polish resistance outside the wire provided limited but significant support, including smuggled news and, in rare cases, small quantities of food or medicine, reinforcing the idea that Majdanek was not entirely sealed off from the broader struggle unfolding in occupied Poland. Yet hope remained cautious, because many prisoners had learned through bitter experience that rumors of liberation could coexist with mass executions, and the memory of large-scale shootings such as Action Erntefest haunted those who survived them, serving as evidence that the regime preferred annihilation to surrender. As Soviet forces approached in July 1944, the SS began evacuating portions of the camp population westward, but unlike other camps that were fully destroyed before liberation, Majdanek's rapid abandonment left significant evidence behind. Gas chambers, barracks, crematoria, intact enough for investigators to see the system laid bare, a failure of concealment that would later distinguish Majdanek in public consciousness as one of the first camps liberated with much of its infrastructure visible. Prisoners who remained during the final days described a mixture of fear and disbelief, as guards fled or reduced control, and on July 23, 1944, Soviet troops entered the camp, encountering survivors in conditions of extreme exhaustion and illness. Liberation, however, did not instantly transform suffering into relief, because typhus and malnutrition still threatened lives, and many died even after the SS had gone, illustrating that the consequences of systemic brutality outlasted the regime's presence. In the immediate aftermath, Soviet authorities documented what they found, photographing gas chambers and stockpiles of belongings, interviewing survivors whose testimonies began the long process of historical record, and for those who had resisted quietly within the camp, the act of speaking became the final and perhaps most enduring form of defiance, ensuring that Majdanek would not dissolve into rumor or denial. Yet memory itself would prove contested, shaped by post-war politics, shifting narratives, and the broader struggle to understand the Holocaust as both singular and systemic. and survivors carried forward not only trauma but also responsibility, aware that their recollections challenged a world often eager to move on from atrocity. Resistance at Majdanek therefore extends beyond the barbed wire and into the present, embodied in testimonies, preserved artifacts, and the physical site that remains accessible to visitors, confronting each generation with evidence that terror was organized, documented, and executed within sight of a city, and that individuals inside the camp refused, in countless small ways, to surrender entirely to dehumanization. This final segment of Chapter 3 underscores a central paradox. While Majdanek was designed to eliminate identity and silence witnesses, it inadvertently created witnesses whose survival and testimony disrupted the regime's attempt at total erasure, proving that even in a system engineered for death, fragments of choice, courage, and memory endured, and that understanding these acts of resistance deepens our comprehension of how the camp functioned, not merely as a place of destruction, but as a battleground where humanity persisted against a structure built to extinguish it. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The gas chambers of Majdanek industrialized killing in plain sight. Unlike camps that were constructed in remote forests and later dismantled in secrecy, Majdanek stood on the outskirts of a major city, visible from roads and farmland, and yet within this openness the machinery of mass murder operated with a chilling blend of bureaucratic routine and calculated deception, revealing how extermination could exist not only in hidden clearings, but in spaces where smoke drifted within sight of ordinary life. By late 1942, Majdanek had evolved from a prisoner of war and labor camp into a site of systematic killing, integrated into the broader framework of Operation Reinhard, and although its gas chambers were smaller than those at Auschwitz-Birkenau, they represented a crucial element of the camp's lethal infrastructure, designed not for spectacle but for efficiency. The gas chambers were housed in a brick building divided into several rooms, some equipped with fake showerheads to reinforce the illusion of disinfection, and prisoners selected for death were often told they were being transferred for work or delousing, a deception that exploited hope even in a place defined by brutality. Zyklon B, the same cyanide-based pesticide used at Auschwitz, was introduced at Majdanek alongside carbon monoxide, and the choice of method reflected experimentation and adaptation within the SS system, a grim reminder that genocide was not static but refined through trial and adjustment. Deportees arriving at Majdanek faced immediate categorization. Some were directed toward forced labor in workshops or agricultural fields, while others, particularly Jews, the elderly, the sick, and children, were selected almost instantly for execution, their belongings confiscated and sorted in warehouses before their lives ended within hours of arrival. The gas chambers operated as part of a broader sequence: registration, stripping, deception, gassing, removal of bodies, cremation or burial, and each step was assigned to prisoner work details under SS supervision, creating a grim hierarchy in which victims were coerced into facilitating the destruction of others, a structure designed to fracture solidarity and obscure direct accountability. Bodies were initially buried in mass graves, but as numbers increased and fears of disease and concealment grew, cremation became standard practice, and Majdanek's crematoria, though not as large as those at Auschwitz, functioned relentlessly, their chimneys emitting smoke that carried the evidence of murder into the sky above Lublin. The presence of gas chambers at Majdanek complicates simplistic narratives that divide camps neatly into labor and death categories, because here forced labor and extermination coexisted within the same perimeter, illustrating the fluidity of Nazi policy and the adaptability of the killing system. Prisoners assigned to Sonderkommando-like duties inside Majdanek faced the unbearable task of handling bodies, cleaning chambers, and preparing rooms for the next group, operating under constant threat of execution to eliminate witnesses. Yet some survived long enough to testify, providing detailed accounts that would later confirm the technical and procedural aspects of the camp's operations. Action Ernefest, carried out in November 1943, marked one of the largest single massacres of Jews during the Holocaust, and at Majdanek thousands were shot in mass executions over the course of 2 days. their bodies dumped into prepared trenches while loud music played to drown out gunfire, a grim orchestration of sound and violence that demonstrated the regime's determination to eliminate Jewish laborers who had temporarily been spared for economic reasons. This mass shooting did not replace the gas chambers but complemented them, revealing the SS willingness to deploy multiple methods of killing depending on logistics, secrecy, and perceived efficiency. The proximity of Majdanek to civilian areas raises enduring questions about awareness, because smoke from crematoria and the movement of transports could not have been entirely invisible. Yet the normalization of repression and the climate of fear within occupied Poland created layers of silence that shielded the camp's function from open acknowledgement. Inside the camp, prisoners lived with the knowledge that selections could occur at any moment, that illness or weakness could redirect them from barracks to chambers, and that survival depended not only on physical endurance but on navigating an unpredictable system governed by quotas, ideology, and the whims of individual guards. Medical experiments, starvation diets, and punitive measures reinforced the atmosphere of total vulnerability, ensuring that even those not immediately targeted for gassing existed within a continuum of lethal risk. The administrative precision behind these killings is evident in surviving documents that recorded transport numbers, death tallies, and confiscated property, reducing human lives to entries in ledgers and revealing how genocide was integrated into paperwork as methodically as industrial production. Yet Majdanek's gas chambers would later stand as evidence the Nazis failed to erase. When Soviet forces entered the camp in July 1944, they discovered structures still largely intact, along with stockpiles of Zyklon B and personal belongings, exposing a killing apparatus that had not been fully dismantled in retreat. This incomplete concealment transformed Majdanek into one of the first camps where investigators could physically examine gas chambers shortly after liberation, challenging denial and shaping early post-war understanding of extermination methods. For survivors, however, the chambers were not abstract proof but spaces saturated with memory. The last place they saw family members, the final boundary between forced labor and annihilation, and their testimonies described the atmosphere of deception, the forced undressing, the smell of chemicals, and the silence that followed the sealing of doors. The existence of these chambers within a camp that also relied heavily on labor exploitation underscores the dual logic of Majdanek. Economic extraction and ideological extermination were not competing priorities but intertwined objectives, each reinforcing the other within a system that treated human beings as expendable resources. Chapter 4 begins here, inside the brick walls of Majdanek's gas chamber complex, because to understand the camp fully, one must confront how killing was mechanized, normalized, and integrated into daily operations, and how the machinery of death functioned not as a sudden eruption of chaos but as a scheduled component of a regime that measured success in numbers erased. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Selections, Deception, and the Routine of Elimination. At Majdanek, death did not always arrive with shouting or visible panic. Often it came quietly, wrapped in procedure, announced as routine, and disguised beneath the language of order and hygiene, which made the system all the more terrifying because it taught prisoners to fear ordinary moments. The roll call, the medical inspection, the sudden command to line up. Selections were not rare events but recurring mechanisms embedded into camp life, and they functioned as the hinge between forced labor and extermination, determining who would continue to work and who would vanish within hours. Prisoners understood that weakness could be fatal. A cough that lingered too long, a limp that slowed formation, a hollowed face that suggested exhaustion. These could mark someone for removal, and removal often meant the gas chambers. SS doctors and officers moved through barracks with clipboards and expressions of bureaucratic detachment, pointing left or right, recording numbers rather than names, reducing complex human lives to categories of fit or unfit. The language used was deliberately sterile. Terms like special treatment or transfer masked the reality of execution, reinforcing the illusion that order and procedure governed the process rather than cruelty and ideology. For new arrivals, deception began the moment trains stopped at the platform. Deportees were often told they were being resettled for work, that they would be disinfected and registered before beginning a new phase of life. Signs indicated bathhouses. Guards spoke in measured tones. Prisoners were instructed to leave luggage in neat piles, told they would retrieve belongings later. The act of organizing possessions created a false sense of continuity, as if tomorrow would exist. In reality, confiscated items were sorted and redistributed through a vast administrative network, clothing cleaned and reused, valuables cataloged, hair cut and collected. Every trace of personal identity absorbed into the machinery of the Reich. The victim's last gestures, tying shoes together, labeling suitcases, comforting children, were exploited by a system that thrived on obedience and confusion. Inside the undressing rooms, prisoners were forced to strip under supervision, often crowded together in conditions designed to increase disorientation. Some recalled that fake showerheads hung from ceilings, reinforcing the narrative of delousing. Others remembered the sudden shift in atmosphere when doors were sealed and guards stepped away. The mechanics of killing were efficient. Gas introduced through vents or pellets dropped through openings, waiting measured in minutes, silence following the initial sounds of panic. When doors reopened, Sonderkommando prisoners, forced laborers assigned to body removal, entered rooms thick with chemical residue, tasked with untangling limbs, extracting gold teeth, cutting hair, and preparing corpses for cremation or burial. The work was systematic, timed, and repeated. Yet Majdanek's selections extended beyond the gas chambers. Action Erntefest in November 1943 demonstrated another layer of elimination. Mass shootings conducted on an enormous scale within the camp perimeter. Prisoners were assembled under pretexts of labor relocation, then marched to trenches prepared in advance. Loudspeakers blared music to conceal gunfire, and victims were ordered to lie atop previous bodies before being shot, forming layers within pits that would later be covered with earth. This operation revealed the flexibility of the killing system. When secrecy demanded speed, bullets replaced gas, and mass graves expanded alongside crematoria. The boundary between extermination camp and concentration camp dissolved completely in such moments, exposing Majdanek as a hybrid site where methods overlapped and reinforced each other. Selections also targeted specific groups. Jewish prisoners were often singled out with increasing frequency as the war progressed, reflecting shifting policies and the accelerating drive toward total annihilation. Soviet prisoners of war faced summary execution, categorized as ideological enemies beyond redemption. Political prisoners who resisted or were suspected of organizing inside the camp could be removed quietly during night roll calls, disappearing without explanation. Even children were not exempt. Those deemed unfit for labor were subject to the same procedures, and their absence from barracks was often explained only through silence. The unpredictability of selection cultivated a climate of constant vigilance, eroding trust and amplifying fear. Prisoners learned to conceal illness, to support one another during inspections, to prop up the weak during roll call so they would appear strong enough to survive another day. Survival became an act of improvisation within rigid structures. The administrative dimension of these processes cannot be separated from the violence itself. Records documented transport numbers, tallied confiscated property, tracked cremation capacity. Bureaucrats ensured that selections aligned with labor demands and ideological priorities. If factories required workers, some prisoners were spared temporarily. If overcrowding threatened sanitation or supply lines, selections intensified. Genocide was not chaos. It was calibrated. The fact that such calculations occurred within offices adjacent to barracks underscores how normalization allowed extraordinary cruelty to coexist with routine paperwork. Clerks stamped forms while smoke rose from crematoria, and each document contributed to a system that treated death as output. Prisoners assigned to assist in selections, interpreters, clerks, or capos, occupied morally precarious positions, often coerced under threat of execution themselves. Their involvement complicates historical memory, illustrating how the system forced victims into roles that sustained its operation. Some attempted subtle resistance, misdirecting names, delaying lists, warning others when possible. Others, broken by fear or tempted by survival privileges, enforced orders harshly. The camp's hierarchy fractured solidarity, turning survival into a series of impossible choices. As Allied forces advanced in 1944, selections at Majdanek did not cease immediately. Instead, the regime oscillated between intensified killing and hurried concealment. Evidence was burned, graves exhumed, yet the pace of retreat prevented complete erasure. When Soviet troops approached Lublin in July 1944, the SS evacuated many prisoners but left behind structures and documentation that would soon reveal the mechanisms described by survivors. The gas chambers, partially intact, stood as physical testimony to the routine of elimination. Zyklon B canisters remained. Barracks still held traces of lives interrupted. Chapter 4, Segment 2 reveals how Majdanek's power lay not only in its physical instruments of death, but in the psychological architecture of selection and deception. By embedding extermination within procedures that appeared orderly, the camp transformed murder into administration. Each inspection, each line formed at dawn, carried the potential for finality. The system relied on predictability to mask unpredictability, on paperwork to legitimize brutality, on the illusion of process to obscure intention. To understand Majdanek fully is to see how elimination became routine, how choices made in offices translated into movements of bodies, how language softened reality, and how, within that structure, prisoners navigated terror with fragile acts of solidarity. The story of selections is not only about who was chosen to die, but about how a modern state refined the act of choosing, and how that refinement became one of its most lethal tools. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Labor, Exhaustion, and the Economy of Death. At Majdanek, death was not only delivered through gas or gunfire, it was manufactured daily through labor calculated to consume the human body until nothing remained but weakness, collapse, and replacement, and this system of attrition functioned with the same precision as any formal execution because work itself had been weaponized, transformed from survival into slow destruction. Prisoners rose before dawn to the sound of whistles and shouted commands, assembling information regardless of illness, injury, or weather, their bodies already depleted by starvation rations that barely sustained life, yet expected to perform tasks that demanded strength they no longer possessed. The camp's proximity to Lublin and to railway lines made it strategically useful within the Nazi war economy. And so Majdanek became both a holding center and a labor reservoir, feeding workers into workshops, storage depots, agricultural fields, and armaments facilities tied to the expanding machinery of war. Every assignment carried risk, not only because of physical strain but because the SS measured productivity with indifference to human limitation. Quotas were set, and those who failed to meet them were beaten, reassigned to punishment details, or placed on lists that led back to selection. The quarrying of stone, the hauling of heavy loads, the construction and expansion of camp infrastructure, and the sorting of confiscated goods all formed part of a broader economic logic in which prisoners were considered expendable tools. Their labor extracted value even as it shortened their lives. The camp's workshops processed clothing seized from murdered deportees, repaired uniforms, and maintained equipment, creating a grotesque cycle in which the belongings of the dead were repurposed by the nearly dead. Agricultural labor units worked surrounding lands, cultivating crops that rarely benefited those who harvested them. In subcamps and external detachments, prisoners were dispatched to factories producing weapons or aircraft components, their skeletal frames bent over machinery for shifts that stretched beyond endurance. Exhaustion accumulated invisibly until it manifested in collapse during roll call or sudden fainting beside a conveyor belt. In such moments, Guards responded not with assistance but with blows, reinforcing the principle that weakness equaled disposability. Hunger shaped every movement. Daily rations, thin soup, scraps of bread, occasional ersatz coffee, were insufficient for sustained physical exertion, and malnutrition eroded muscle and immunity alike. Prisoners bartered crumbs, traded possessions, or formed small alliances to share food, understanding that survival depended on cooperation as much as personal endurance. Yet even solidarity could not counteract the systemic imbalance between caloric intake and labor output. Disease thrived in these conditions. Dysentery spread through contaminated water and overcrowded latrines. Typhus and other infections circulated in barracks where ventilation failed and lice multiplied unchecked. Medical care, when available, was minimal and often cruel. Infirmaries became waiting rooms for selection rather than spaces of recovery. To report illness risked removal from work details and possible execution, so many concealed symptoms until collapse forced attention. Punishment intertwined seamlessly with labor. Minor infractions, speaking out of turn, slowing a march, misplacing equipment, triggered penalties that ranged from reduced rations to confinement or public beating. The camp's disciplinary structures served both to enforce productivity and to fracture morale, reminding prisoners that control was absolute. Capos, themselves inmates granted limited authority, often enforced quotas harshly, navigating the impossible balance between satisfying SS demands and preserving some measure of humanity. Some succumbed to brutality, others attempted subtle protection of their work units, but all operated within constraints designed to produce fear and compliance. Majdanek's labor system also intersected with its extermination function. When deportations increased and camp populations swelled beyond capacity, work assignments provided temporary reprieve for those deemed fit. Yet that fitness was measured narrowly and reevaluated constantly. As prisoners weakened, they drifted from labor details back toward selection lines. Thus, labor extended life only conditionally, and the distinction between worker and victim blurred over time. The economic exploitation of prisoners did not contradict extermination. It complemented it. Bodies were consumed first through work, then through more direct means when no longer useful. This integration of exploitation and annihilation underscores how genocide operated not as isolated episodes but as continuous processes feeding one another. During the final phases of occupation, as front lines shifted and resources dwindled, labor intensified even as supply chains faltered. The SS sought to extract maximum value before retreat, accelerating shifts and redistributing prisoners to projects deemed urgent. Meanwhile, food deliveries decreased and infrastructure deteriorated. The imbalance between demand and capacity widened, and mortality rose accordingly. Barracks filled with men too weak to stand, yet still expected to report for duty. Corpses were removed each morning before roll call, an administrative routine that maintained the illusion of order amid collapse. Yet within this landscape of exhaustion, fragments of resistance persisted. Prisoners sabotaged machinery subtly, slowed production in ways difficult to detect, or shared technical knowledge to reduce strain on weaker comrades. Such acts rarely altered the overall trajectory of the system, but they asserted a form of agency within imposed helplessness. Even the decision to share a crust of bread or to support a staggering figure during formation represented defiance against a regime that sought to atomize individuals into isolated units of labor. Survival became collective whenever possible, though the system constantly undermined collective strength. When Soviet forces approached in July 1944, Majdanek's labor apparatus began to unravel. Some prisoners were evacuated to camps deeper within the Reich, marched along roads already littered with casualties from other evacuations. Others remained as guards attempted partial destruction of facilities. Workshops fell silent. Machinery halted, The calculus that had measured output against human cost dissolved into haste and disorganization. Yet the evidence of labor as weapon remained visible. Quarries scarred by forced excavation, barracks worn by overcrowding, records documenting shifts and quotas. Chapter 4, Segment 3 reveals that at Majdanek, work was neither neutral nor redemptive. It was engineered as an instrument of attrition, calibrated to exhaust without immediately extinguishing, to extract utility before discarding life. The camp demonstrates how economic logic and ideological hatred fused into a single mechanism where productivity justified cruelty and efficiency masked annihilation. In understanding this system, we confront a deeper truth about genocide in modern societies. That destruction can be embedded within ordinary structures of employment, accounting, and scheduling, until suffering appears as a byproduct rather than the objective. Majdanek's labor fields and workshops were not peripheral to its killing mission. They were integral to it, extending the reach of extermination into the rhythms of daily work. And in that fusion of routine and ruin lies one of the most unsettling lessons the camp leaves behind. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Mass Murder and Action Erntefest. By late 1943, Majdanek had evolved beyond a hybrid camp of imprisonment, labor, and selective killing. It had become a central execution ground within Operation Reinhard, the Nazi program designed to eliminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland with industrial speed and bureaucratic coordination. And nowhere was this transformation more brutally visible than in the events leading up to what the SS cynically named Action Erntefest, Operation Harvest Festival. The phrase suggested abundance and seasonal routine, yet behind that language lay one of the largest single massacres of Jews carried out by German forces during the entire war. In the months before the operation, tensions inside Majdanek intensified as ghettos were liquidated, resistance movements flared, and the SS feared uprisings similar to those that had erupted in Treblinka and Sobibor. The leadership resolved that the remaining Jewish laborers in the Lublin district must be eliminated at once, not gradually, but in a coordinated, overwhelming act of violence that would crush both bodies and the possibility of rebellion. Preparations were disguised as construction projects. Trenches were ordered dug near the camp's crematoria and execution fields under the pretense of defensive measures against air raids. Loudspeakers were installed. Logistical details were synchronized across camps in the region, including Troniki and Poniatowa, ensuring that the killings would occur simultaneously, preventing news from spreading and resistance from organizing. On November 3, 1943, before dawn, SS units surrounded Majdanek with reinforced detachments of police and auxiliary forces, sealing the perimeter with calculated precision. Jewish prisoners were ordered out of their barracks and marched toward the prepared trenches under heavy guard. Told they were being relocated or processed for work details, a deception maintained until the final moments to avoid panic that might disrupt the schedule. Groups were forced to undress, surrender possessions, and descend into the pits in rows. Machine guns were positioned strategically so that firing could proceed continuously, wave after wave, bodies collapsing into layered graves that were then covered only to make room for the next line. To drown out the sound of gunfire and screaming, music blared from loudspeakers across the camp, transforming mass murder into a grotesque spectacle masked by forced festivity. Witnesses later recalled the surreal dissonance between orchestral recordings and the rhythm of automatic fire, between official composure and human annihilation. By the end of that single day at Majdanek alone, approximately 18,000 Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered, shot in open pits within sight of barracks and guard towers, their deaths recorded as administrative accomplishment rather than tragedy. But Action Erntefest was not confined to Majdanek. It unfolded simultaneously at Troniki and Poniatowa, bringing the total number of victims to more than 40,000 in 2 days, making it the largest single massacre of Jews by German forces in the entire Holocaust. The coordination demonstrated how the Nazi state could mobilize bureaucratic planning, transport systems, and armed units with chilling efficiency when the objective was extermination. For Majdanek, the massacre marked both culmination and transition. The Jewish labor force that had sustained workshops and construction units was decimated, altering the camp's demographic structure and intensifying reliance on non-Jewish prisoners and deportees from other regions. Yet the massacre also revealed the regime's mounting anxiety as the Eastern Front shifted and Soviet advances threatened to expose evidence of crimes committed in relative secrecy. Action Erntefest was intended not only to kill but to eliminate potential witnesses and suppress the possibility of coordinated resistance in the Lublin district. It reflected a logic of preemptive extermination driven by fear of revolt and fear of accountability. In the days that followed, surviving prisoners were forced to cover the graves more thoroughly and to clean the killing grounds, an act of coerced participation that compounded trauma. The stench of freshly buried bodies lingered over the camp, mingling with smoke from crematoria that struggled to manage the volume of death. Administrative reports framed the operation as a security measure, citing the need to stabilize the region. Language stripped the massacre of moral content, reducing tens of thousands of lives to entries in memoranda. Yet within prisoner communities, the memory of that day became seared as undeniable proof that labor or compliance offered no lasting protection. Even those deemed useful could be eliminated overnight if policy demanded it. Action Erntefest thus exposes the final erosion of any distinction between exploitation and extermination. When ideological goals required speed, the system shifted from gradual attrition to immediate annihilation without hesitation. Chapter 5 begins here because understanding Majdanek requires confronting this moment when mass shooting, direct, visible, unambiguous, became the chosen method, when pits replaced pretense and the machinery of genocide operated in plain daylight within earshot of the camp population. It underscores how the Holocaust was not a static model but an adaptable system, capable of shifting methods while preserving intent. Action Erntefest stands as both culmination of Operation Reinhard in the Lublin district and warning of what state power can achieve when secrecy, obedience, and ideology align without restraint. The massacre did not occur in chaos but in coordination, not in secrecy alone but in structured sequence, revealing once more that genocide in modern Europe functioned through administration as much as through brutality. In Majdanek, November 1943 marked the day when the camp's dual identity as labor site and killing ground converged fully, leaving behind trenches filled with victims and a silence heavy with the knowledge that extermination could be executed not only behind gas chamber doors, but under open sky, in a single, meticulously planned operation. Chapter 5, Segment 2. After the massacre, erasure, control, and the camp reconfigured. In the weeks that followed Action Erntefest, Majdanek did not fall silent. Instead, it shifted into a new phase of calculated control, where the absence left by tens of thousands of murdered Jewish prisoners reshaped the internal structure of the camp while the SS quietly worked to minimize traces of what had occurred, not because they intended to abandon killing, but because the Eastern Front was drawing closer and the need to manage evidence became urgent. The trenches dug for mass execution were leveled and camouflaged, burial sites compacted and concealed beneath layers of soil. Selected prisoner labor details were ordered to dismantle structures, burn documents, and reorganize storage warehouses, transforming physical space as if rearranging a stage after a violent performance. Clothing confiscated from victims was sorted and packed for shipment to the Reich, continuing the bureaucratic logic that nothing, even after massacre, should go unused. Gold teeth, watches, and personal valuables were processed through administrative channels, converted into financial assets for the regime. Death remained efficient not only in its execution but in its accounting. Inside the camp, the demographic landscape shifted dramatically. Jewish prisoners, once a central labor force in workshops and subcamps, had been nearly annihilated in the Lublin district, leaving behind a population increasingly composed of Polish political detainees, Soviet prisoners of war, and deportees transferred from other collapsing camps as the Red Army advanced. The SS recalibrated work assignments to maintain production quotas for the war economy. Even as Germany's military position deteriorated, Majdanek continued to supply labor to armaments factories and construction sites tied to defensive projects. The paradox deepened. A regime losing ground invested resources in preserving systems of coercion and exploitation, prioritizing discipline and output even while retreat loomed. The camp became more overcrowded as evacuations from eastern territories brought in new transports. Barracks filled beyond intended capacity, sanitation collapsed further, and disease re-emerged with renewed intensity. Typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition eroded bodies weakened by prior imprisonment elsewhere, creating an atmosphere where death no longer required organized shooting. Neglect and exhaustion carried out what policy no longer needed to formalize in mass execution pits. The SS maintained an outward veneer of order. Roll calls continued, punishments were administered with ritual precision, and internal hierarchies among prisoners were manipulated to sustain control. Capos, often selected from criminal classifications, were empowered to enforce discipline, creating layers of coercion that extended beyond direct SS oversight. Fear remained the organizing principle. The memory of Erntefest lingered as silent warning. Compliance offered no guarantee of survival, yet resistance invited immediate reprisal. In this psychological landscape, obedience was shaped less by hope than by calculation. Survive one more day, conserve strength, avoid notice. And yet, even under intensified repression, fragments of resistance persisted. Prisoners shared scraps of information about the war's progress, hidden radios circulated cautiously among trusted groups, and networks that had formed before the massacre adapted to the new reality. They understood that the regime was weakening. Rumors of Soviet advances and Allied landings filtered through guarded conversations, creating a fragile thread of expectation that the system, however brutal, was not eternal. Meanwhile, outside the camp perimeter, the broader machinery of Operation Reinhard had largely completed its genocidal objective in the Lublin region. Belzec had already been dismantled and concealed. Sobibor had witnessed revolt and subsequent closure. Treblinka too had been destroyed in an attempt to erase its existence. Majdanek, however, remained operational longer than intended, partly because of its dual function as concentration and labor camp, and partly because its scale and location made rapid dismantling more complex. Its continued operation became a liability as Soviet forces pushed westward. The SS began drafting contingency plans, partial evacuations, destruction of sensitive records, reassignment of personnel, but these plans unfolded unevenly. Unlike other camps where systematic demolition preceded Allied arrival, Majdanek would eventually be overrun with much of its infrastructure intact, a failure of concealment that would later shape global understanding of Nazi crimes. Yet at this moment, in late 1943 and early 1944, that outcome was not yet inevitable. Administrators still believed they could maintain control long enough to manage withdrawal on their own terms. The psychological climate among prisoners grew increasingly volatile. New arrivals brought first-hand accounts of other camps being emptied or burned. Some described forced marches westward under brutal conditions, where those unable to walk were shot and left behind. These stories intensified both fear and anticipation. If Majdanek were evacuated, what would follow? A march through winter fields? A transport toward an unknown destination? Or execution to eliminate witnesses? The uncertainty became another instrument of control. Guards exploited it deliberately, spreading contradictory rumors, reinforcing the idea that survival depended entirely on SS decisions. Yet paradoxically, the same uncertainty opened space for clandestine planning. Resistance groups began discussing how to respond if evacuation orders came, whether to attempt escape amid chaos or to hide within the camp itself. Chapter 5, Segment 2 thus marks Majdanek's transformation from epicenter of coordinated massacre to site of tense anticipation, where erasure and continuation coexisted. The physical traces of Action Erntefest were partially buried, But the memory could not be erased from those who had witnessed it. It shaped every calculation thereafter. The camp remained lethal not because mass shootings continued at the same scale, but because starvation, disease, forced labor, and calculated neglect functioned as quieter instruments of destruction. Bureaucracy adjusted. Terror endured. As the war turned decisively against Nazi Germany, Majdanek persisted as both labor hub and evidence of a system straining to conceal itself while still operating. The killings of November 1943 had demonstrated how swiftly policy could pivot toward immediate extermination. The months that followed revealed how a camp could reconfigure itself without abandoning its fundamental logic. Work assignments resumed. Quotas were met. Bodies weakened. Records were filed. And beneath the apparent continuity lay a single, growing reality. The front lines were approaching, and for the first time since its creation, Majdanek existed within reach of collapse. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Approaching collapse. The camp waits for the front. By early 1944, Majdanek stood in a state of uneasy suspension, functioning as a concentration and labor camp while the Eastern Front advanced steadily toward Lublin, and within its barbed wire boundaries a tension settled that was different from the fear of selections or sudden shootings. It was the tension of uncertainty, of a system that sensed its own vulnerability yet continued to operate as if permanence were still possible, and the SS administrators found themselves balancing two contradictory imperatives: maintain order, productivity, and discipline, while quietly preparing for the possibility that the Red Army might arrive faster than expected. Barracks remained overcrowded, though the vast Jewish population of the Lublin district had been annihilated. New transports arrived from other threatened camps farther east, bringing prisoners already emaciated, already marked by previous brutality, and Majdanek absorbed them into a structure that could barely sustain those already inside. Food rations shrank further as supply lines fractured. Watery soup and crusts of bread were divided into portions too small to restore strength, and disease continued its relentless arithmetic, claiming lives through typhus, dysentery, and untreated infections that thrived in conditions of filth and exhaustion. Forced labor assignments intensified rather than diminished. Prisoners were dispatched to repair roads, expand workshops, dismantle equipment from threatened subcamps, and assist in relocating materials considered valuable to the Reich's war effort, and every task carried the same logic: extract usefulness until the body failed, then replace it. Inside the administrative offices, paperwork continued to circulate with chilling normalcy. Transport lists were compiled, inventory records adjusted, and correspondence with higher SS authorities maintained. Yet increasingly those communications reflected anxiety about proximity to the front, about securing personnel transfers, about protecting or destroying sensitive documentation. Some records were burned. Others were hurriedly boxed for relocation. Warehouses containing confiscated property were partially cleared, valuables sent westward in anticipation of retreat. But the sheer scale of accumulated goods, clothing, shoes, suitcases stripped from victims, made complete concealment impossible. The SS had learned from the dismantling of Belzec and Treblinka how to erase a site when time permitted. At Majdanek, time was narrowing. Guard units were redeployed unpredictably, some reassigned to defensive positions, others withdrawn entirely, creating gaps in supervision that prisoners noticed immediately. The rigid certainty that had defined earlier years began to fracture. Commands were shouted with the same force, but beneath them lay strain. For prisoners, this shift in atmosphere was both terrifying and galvanizing. Rumors circulated more freely as guard vigilance faltered. Whispered accounts of Soviet advances reached the barracks, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes precise, but always carrying the same implication. Liberation might come not through negotiation or survival strategy, but through military conquest. Yet hope remained cautious, because prisoners also understood the pattern unfolding elsewhere. Camps evacuated in death marches, witnesses forced westward under gunpoint, those too weak to walk shot along the roadside. The memory of action Ernstfest lingered as a warning that mass killing could be executed swiftly if the SS chose annihilation over evacuation. Resistance networks inside Majdanek weighed options carefully. Some prisoners prepared hiding places within attics and storage areas, gambling that chaos might allow them to remain unseen if guards fled. Others discussed seizing weapons should an uprising become feasible, though the camp's layout and dwindling numbers made large-scale revolt unlikely. Survival calculations became daily rituals. Conserve strength, observe guard patterns, secure scraps of food, remain alert for sudden orders. The physical environment mirrored this instability. Parts of the camp showed signs of neglect as maintenance crews were reassigned or disbanded. Fencing sagged in sections, watch rotations thinned, and administrative discipline softened under pressure. Yet cruelty did not disappear. Punishments were still administered for minor infractions, beatings continued, and executions occurred sporadically, especially against those suspected of sabotage or resistance. Violence no longer carried the same theatrical certainty. It was sharper, more reactive, born of frustration rather than ideological demonstration. The SS leadership faced a dilemma: whether to transform Majdanek into another site of systematic destruction before retreat, or to withdraw quickly enough to avoid encirclement. Ultimately, logistical realities dictated hesitation. The Red Army's rapid approach left insufficient time to fully dismantle the complex, and evacuation planning faltered amid competing priorities. As Soviet artillery could be heard faintly in the distance, the psychological boundary between captivity and impending change thinned. Prisoners sensed that history was pressing against the camp's perimeter. Some guards disappeared overnight. Others adopted a harsher tone, aware that authority might soon evaporate. Administrative offices accelerated document destruction, smoke rising from fires intended to erase incriminating evidence. Yet the scale of the site and the speed of advance undermined thorough concealment. Warehouses, crematoria, gas chambers, barracks, all stood as physical testimony that could not be removed in days. The camp that had functioned as a node within Operation Reinhardt's genocidal network was now exposed by geography and time. Chapter 5, Segment 3 captures this suspended moment before liberation, when Majdanek remained operational but unstable, when starvation and disease continued their work even as the front closed in, when administrators oscillated between routine and panic, and when prisoners balanced fear of evacuation against fragile hope of imminent freedom. It was a period defined not by a single dramatic event but by mounting pressure, by the sense that the system which had seemed unassailable was beginning to fracture under the weight of military defeat. The machinery of control still turned, but unevenly. Commands still echoed, but without certainty of endurance. In this narrowing window between domination and collapse, Majdanek revealed another truth about the Holocaust system. Its power depended on momentum, on uninterrupted coordination across territories and agencies, and when that coordination faltered, the facade of permanence dissolved. Yet, until the very last hour before liberation, suffering persisted. Prisoners continued to die of hunger and illness. Guards continued to enforce discipline. Bureaucrats continued to file papers. And over the camp, heavy with smoke and anticipation, hung a single unspoken question. Would the regime manage to erase what it had built, or would Majdanek become the camp the Nazis failed to hide? Chapter 6, Segment 1. Liberation without erasure. The Red Army arrives at Majdanek. In July 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward in the wake of Operation Bagration, Majdanek became one of the first major concentration camps to fall into Allied hands largely intact, and this fact alone would distinguish it from many other sites of the Nazi camp system, because unlike Belzec or Treblinka, carefully dismantled and disguised, Majdanek did not have time to disappear. The Red Army advanced faster than the SS could execute a complete evacuation or destruction plan. And, in the final days before liberation, Confusion rippled through the camp as German personnel began withdrawing, burning documents in haste, attempting to destroy certain facilities, yet leaving behind vast physical evidence that could not be erased within the shrinking window of time. Prisoners sensed the shift immediately. Guards abandoned posts, administrative order fractured, and the once rigid routines of roll calls and labor detachments faltered as artillery thundered closer, the sound carrying across the flat fields surrounding Lublin, signaling not abstract rumors but imminent confrontation. Some SS men fled outright, others attempted limited evacuations, forcing selected prisoners westward in hurried columns, yet many detainees remained inside the barbed wire perimeter when Soviet troops entered the outskirts of the city on July 23. What the Red Army encountered was not an empty compound but a functioning camp in collapse. Thousands of prisoners still alive though gravely weakened, warehouses stacked with confiscated property, crematoria buildings standing, gas chambers structurally visible, and barracks crowded with skeletal survivors whose conditions bore immediate witness to systematic deprivation. The arrival itself was chaotic rather than ceremonially triumphant. Soviet soldiers advanced through the gates cautiously, unsure of what resistance might remain, and the initial moments combined disbelief with urgency as they confronted emaciated figures emerging from barracks, some too weak to stand, others attempting to speak in broken phrases about starvation, shootings, and selections. Medical personnel attached to advancing units began triage almost immediately, recognizing outbreaks of typhus and dysentery, distributing basic rations carefully to avoid fatal shock to bodies long deprived of adequate nutrition, and isolating the most contagious cases in makeshift infirmaries established within the campgrounds. The smell of decay lingered. Partially burned documents and abandoned equipment testified to the SS effort to obscure records, yet evidence remained overwhelming. Piles of shoes sorted by size, suitcases marked with names and addresses, warehouses containing clothing and personal effects stripped from deportees, and structures clearly identifiable as gas chambers and crematoria, though some machinery had been damaged in the final hours. Unlike camps liberated later in the West, where death marches had removed most prisoners and infrastructure was partially destroyed, Majdanek presented a nearly complete tableau of the camp system's mechanisms: administration, storage, killing facilities, and forced labor infrastructure visible within a single compound. For prisoners, liberation was not a single emotional register but a spectrum ranging from stunned silence to fragile relief. Many were too weak to celebrate, their bodies ravaged by malnutrition, disease, and months or years of forced labor, and the psychological transition from absolute control to sudden absence of guards created disorientation as profound as joy. Some survivors feared German return. Others wept openly. Many simply lay in bunks unable to process that the regime which had governed every minute of their existence had collapsed in a matter of hours. Soviet officers quickly recognized the propaganda and evidentiary significance of what they had found. Journalists and photographers were brought to document the site, capturing images of barracks, crematoria, storage rooms, and surviving prisoners, images that would circulate internationally as some of the earliest visual proof of the Nazi camp system's scale and brutality. These photographs and reports played a crucial role in countering denial narratives already beginning to form, because Majdanek stood as physical refutation of claims that extermination camps were exaggerations or fabrications. Yet liberation also initiated complex challenges. The campgrounds were contaminated by disease. Typhus outbreaks required strict quarantine measures, and Soviet medical teams struggled with limited supplies while attempting to prevent further fatalities among survivors already at the brink of collapse. Food distribution had to be carefully measured. Too much nourishment too quickly could induce refeeding syndrome, a medical danger not yet fully understood, but observed through tragic outcomes when emaciated bodies failed under sudden intake. Burial details were organized to inter the dead with greater dignity than the regime had allowed, though the scale of mortality meant mass graves were still necessary. Simultaneously, investigators began cataloging evidence. Administrative records left behind, storage inventories, testimonies from prisoners able to speak, and structural analysis of killing facilities. Majdanek thus transformed rapidly from a site of imprisonment into a site of investigation. Chapter 6, Segment 1 centers on this extraordinary moment when the machinery of genocide was interrupted not by gradual dismantling but by military momentum, leaving Majdanek exposed to the world. The camp's liberation demonstrated that the Holocaust system relied on territorial control and coordinated retreat to conceal its crimes. When that control fractured, the infrastructure of atrocity became visible in raw form. For the first time, Allied forces encountered an extermination-linked camp whose gas chambers and crematoria stood largely intact, whose warehouses overflowed with the material remnants of murdered lives, and whose surviving prisoners could testify immediately. The Red Army's arrival did not erase suffering overnight. Many liberated prisoners would die in the days and weeks that followed due to illness and exhaustion. But it ended the camp's function as an instrument of the Reich. The barbed wire remained, the guard towers still cast shadows, yet authority had shifted irrevocably. Majdanek became, in that instant, not a hidden node within a secret network, but an open crime scene, one the Nazis had failed to hide. Chapter 6, Segment 2, Documenting the Crime, Evidence, Testimony, and the First War Crimes Trials at Majdanek. When Majdanek fell into Soviet hands in July 1944, liberation did not conclude the story of the camp. It began a second chapter defined not by barbed wire and roll calls, but by documentation, testimony, and the urgent race to preserve evidence before memory could fade or denial could take root. And almost immediately the Soviet authorities recognized that what they had discovered was not only a humanitarian catastrophe but also a legal and historical reckoning in waiting. A site whose intact infrastructure, gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses filled with shoes and clothing, administrative offices, guard towers, and prisoner barracks, offered a rare opportunity to expose the inner workings of the Nazi camp system while the war still raged. Investigative commissions were formed within days, composed of military officials, forensic specialists, doctors, and legal representatives tasked with recording every visible trace of criminality, from structural blueprints of execution facilities to inventories of confiscated personal property. And they moved methodically through the compound, measuring gas chamber dimensions, collecting residue samples from walls and vents, photographing cremation ovens, cataloging Zyklon B containers where found, and cross-referencing surviving paperwork with prisoner accounts in order to reconstruct the scale of deportations and deaths that had occurred within Majdanek's perimeter. Survivors were interviewed as soon as their medical condition allowed, their statements transcribed carefully, often through translators, describing arrival procedures, selections, forced labor details, beatings, executions, and the rhythms of starvation that had defined daily life. These testimonies carried both emotional weight and evidentiary value, because unlike camps whose prisoners had been marched away, Majdanek still held thousands who could speak directly to what they had endured only days before. Forensic teams exhumed mass graves within and around the campgrounds, documenting bodies in various states of decomposition, identifying patterns of gunshot wounds and signs of disease, and attempting, where possible, to determine causes of death that ranged from execution to typhus to deliberate deprivation, while medical examiners compiled reports describing extreme malnutrition, skeletal wasting, untreated infections, and trauma consistent with systematic abuse. Each report became part of a growing archive intended not only for wartime propaganda but for future judicial proceedings. The Soviet press publicized Majdanek extensively, presenting it as irrefutable proof of Nazi barbarity, and journalists were escorted through the site to witness piles of shoes, heaps of hair, warehouses stacked with suitcases bearing names and addresses, and barracks still smelling of sickness and decay. Photographs and newsreels circulated internationally, shocking audiences who had not yet fully grasped the scale of extermination. And while skepticism remained in some quarters abroad, the Visual evidence from Majdanek marked one of the earliest tangible confirmations of industrialized murder on a massive scale. Yet the process of documentation also carried political complexity. Soviet authorities framed the narrative within broader wartime messaging, emphasizing fascist crimes against Soviet citizens and Slavic populations, while sometimes subsuming the specifically Jewish dimension of genocide into a generalized account of Nazi atrocities, a framing that would later influence how Majdanek's history was remembered in Eastern Europe during the post-war period. In late 1944, even before Germany's surrender, one of the first war crimes trials connected to a concentration camp was convened in Lublin, where several former Majdanek staff members were prosecuted by Soviet and Polish authorities, and these early proceedings established precedents for how camp personnel could be charged with crimes against humanity, murder, and participation in systematic abuse. Evidence presented included survivor testimony, forensic findings, administrative documents recovered from the camp, and material artifacts such as uniforms and records linking defendants to specific functions within the camp hierarchy. Unlike later, more extensive trials held after the war, these initial proceedings unfolded while fighting continued elsewhere in Europe, underscoring the immediacy with which Majdanek's liberation had transformed it into a courtroom of sorts, a place where crimes were no longer hidden behind euphemisms like special treatment or evacuation, but described plainly as murder and persecution. Survivors who testified faced the challenge of recounting trauma only weeks removed from its occurrence, often while still physically weakened, yet many insisted on speaking, driven by a determination that what had happened inside the camp should not be minimized or forgotten. At the same time, logistical challenges complicated the investigative effort. Disease outbreaks required continued quarantine measures, buildings needed disinfection, and some evidence had already been partially destroyed by the SS in the days before liberation, including burned documents and dismantled equipment, forcing investigators to reconstruct missing data through cross-analysis of remaining paperwork and prisoner recollections. Nevertheless, the scale of surviving infrastructure meant that Majdanek stood as one of the most comprehensively documented camps at such an early stage of liberation, and its evidence would later contribute to broader Allied understanding of Operation Reinhard and the interconnected network of extermination and labor camps across occupied Poland. As the war ended in May 1945, Majdanek's documentation fed into preparations for larger judicial efforts, including the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, where prosecutors drew upon evidence from multiple camps to establish the systematic nature of Nazi crimes. Majdanek's intact gas chambers and crematoria served as powerful counterarguments to any claim that extermination was a battlefield rumor or partisan exaggeration. Chapter 6, Segment 2 reveals that liberation alone did not secure justice. It required deliberate preservation, meticulous recording, and legal framing to transform atrocity into prosecutable fact, and Majdanek became one of the first places where this transformation occurred while the war was still underway. The camp that the Nazis failed to hide now functioned as a repository of proof. Its barracks converted into investigative sites, its crematoria into forensic exhibits, its surviving prisoners into witnesses whose voices carried beyond the barbed wire into courtrooms and newspapers. In documenting Majdanek, investigators confronted not only the brutality of individual guards but the architecture of a system. Administrative chains of command, supply lines delivering poison and construction materials, transport schedules coordinating deportations, and bureaucratic language masking murder. The evidence gathered in those months would ripple outward for decades, shaping trials in Poland, Germany, and beyond, and embedding Majdanek into the legal and moral reckoning that followed the collapse of the Third Reich. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Memory, Denial, and the Long Struggle to Remember Majdanek. When the guns fell silent and Europe began the slow work of rebuilding, Majdanek did not disappear into rubble like so many other camps. Instead, it remained standing on the outskirts of Lublin, its barracks, watchtowers, gas chambers, and crematoria preserved not because the perpetrators wished it so, but because they had not had time to erase it, And this physical survival placed Majdanek in a unique and complicated position within post-war memory, for it became one of the earliest sites. Transformed into a memorial museum, even as the political realities of the emerging Cold War shaped how its story would be told. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, Polish and Soviet authorities moved to conserve the grounds, erecting monuments and organizing exhibitions that presented the camp as evidence of fascist barbarity and martyrdom. Yet the narrative emphasized collective suffering under Nazi occupation, often subsuming the specifically Jewish catastrophe into a broader account of crimes against Polish and Soviet citizens, a framing that reflected both ideological priorities and the political climate of Eastern Europe under Soviet influence. Thus, Majdanek stood simultaneously as a preserved crime scene and as a symbol molded by contemporary power structures. Survivors returned in small numbers, some to search for traces of lost relatives, others to bear witness before memorial plaques and rows of barracks, and their presence introduced another layer to the site's meaning. For personal memory did not always align neatly with official interpretation, and over the decades survivors and historians would work to reassert the full complexity of Majdanek's population. Jews deported during Operation Reinhard, Polish political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma families, and countless others who passed through its gates. As trials continued in Poland and later in West Germany, testimony from Majdanek resurfaced in courtrooms, sometimes decades after the crimes, challenging societies that preferred to look forward rather than back. Former guards and administrators were prosecuted in a series of proceedings stretching into the 1970s, including high-profile trials in Dusseldorf that examined the structure of the camp and the individual roles of SS personnel, forcing the public to confront evidence that Majdanek had not been an anomaly but part of a coordinated network of persecution and extermination. Yet denial and minimization also emerged, particularly among segments of the German population reluctant to accept the full scale of culpability. And even internationally there were voices who questioned early Soviet reports, casting doubt on casualty figures or suggesting exaggeration, despite the physical reality of the preserved gas chambers and crematoria standing as mute but undeniable witnesses. Majdanek's existence complicated denial because it had not been reduced to ash, because its structures could be walked through, measured, and analyzed, because its archives contained documents, transport lists, and administrative orders that exposed the bureaucratic nature of murder. Over time, scholarly research deepened understanding of the camp's evolution, clarifying its dual function as both concentration and extermination site, and refining estimates of those murdered there, replacing inflated wartime numbers with evidence-based calculations while reaffirming the enormity of loss, and this academic rigor strengthened rather than weakened the historical case, demonstrating that truth could withstand scrutiny. Educational programs expanded, bringing students to Majdanek's grounds where guides explained how barracks were organized, how selections operated, how forced labor intersected with mass killing, and how the camp fit into Operation Reinhard and the wider Holocaust. The preserved barracks and gas chambers became tools not of terror but of instruction, though the atmosphere remained heavy, a silence that visitors often described as more powerful than any spoken explanation. Artistic memorials were added, including monumental sculptures and mausoleums containing human ashes collected from the camp, intended to honor victims while confronting visitors with the material reality of destruction. These spaces invited reflection not only on the past but on the mechanisms that enabled it: propaganda, obedience, prejudice, and indifference. Chapter 6, Segment 3 follows Majdanek beyond liberation into the contested terrain of remembrance, where memory competes with forgetfulness and documentation stands against distortion. The camp that the Nazis failed to hide became a place that could not easily be denied, yet remembrance required constant effort. Historians verifying sources, educators contextualizing events, survivors speaking despite fading strength, archivists preserving fragile documents, and communities insisting that the narrative include all who suffered within those fences. Majdanek's survival as a physical site created a bridge between generations, allowing the past to be encountered not only through text but through space, through the rough wood of barracks and the cold brick of gas chambers, and this tangible presence has ensured that its story remains part of the broader understanding of the Holocaust as a system, planned, administered, and executed with bureaucratic precision. In remembering Majdanek, societies confront an uncomfortable lesson: that atrocity can be organized within ordinary structures, that law can be bent to serve cruelty, and that memory itself must be actively defended. The camp endures not as a relic of horror alone, but as a warning carved into the landscape, a testament that evidence, once preserved, can outlast attempts to erase it, and that the responsibility to remember is ongoing, extending far beyond the day the gates were opened. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Operation Reinhard and Majdanek's role in the machinery of extermination. Majdanek did not exist in isolation. It stood as part of a larger design, a network of camps and administrative structures known as Operation Reinhard, the code name for the systematic murder of the Jews of occupied Poland. And to understand Majdanek's role is to understand how extermination was transformed from scattered massacres into coordinated policy, how rail schedules, property inventories, and deportation lists converged into a single lethal system. By 1942, after the Wannsee Conference had formalized plans for the so-called final solution, the German authorities in the general government moved with accelerating urgency to eliminate Jewish communities across the region, constructing dedicated death camps at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka where most arrivals were killed within hours, while Majdanek occupied a more complex position, functioning simultaneously as a concentration camp, forced labor site, and killing center, absorbing transports that were sometimes selected for work and sometimes directed toward immediate death. Trains arrived at Majdanek from ghettos emptied during the liquidation campaigns: Lublin, Warsaw, Białystok, and smaller towns whose names would fade from maps. Each transport representing not only individuals but entire social worlds uprooted in a single order, and upon arrival the process unfolded with chilling routine. Disembarkation under armed guard, confiscation of belongings, separation by gender and perceived ability to work, and the sorting of people into categories that determined their fate. Within the framework of Operation Reinhard, efficiency was paramount. Property stolen from victims, clothing, currency, jewelry, even hair, was collected, sorted, and shipped to Germany, while labor from selected prisoners was redirected into workshops and nearby enterprises supporting the war economy, and Majdanek became a node in this chain, where exploitation and extermination overlapped rather than remained distinct phases. The presence of gas chambers at Majdanek, though smaller and less systematically used than those in pure death camps, signaled that the camp's administrators were prepared to kill on command, particularly during moments of overcrowding or policy shifts when transports exceeded labor demand, and this flexibility revealed how adaptable the system had become, capable of adjusting the balance between work and death without altering its underlying objective. Guards and officials operated within a bureaucratic structure that masked brutality behind terminology: special treatment, resettlement, processing, phrases that drained language of moral weight while facilitating action, and beneath these abstractions lay concrete realities: starvation rations, typhus outbreaks, beatings in barracks, and selections that separated families with a gesture of a hand. Chapter 7 begins by situating Majdanek firmly within the architecture of Operation Reinhard, tracing how decisions made in Berlin translated into deportation orders in Polish towns, how regional SS leaders coordinated with railway authorities, and how camps communicated through reports that measured human beings in numbers rather than names. It examines the transformation of Lublin district into a laboratory of extermination policy under SS and police leader Odilo Globoknik, whose office oversaw both the death camps and Majdanek, integrating them into a unified system designed to eliminate Jewish life while extracting every possible resource. As ghettos were liquidated, survivors who were deemed temporarily useful were routed to Majdanek for labor, particularly in workshops producing uniforms, repairing equipment, or constructing facilities. Yet the line between survival and execution remained fragile, dependent on fluctuating needs and arbitrary decisions. Within the camp, prisoners became aware, sometimes gradually and sometimes with sudden clarity, that they were living inside a larger plan. Rumors traveled through barracks about transports vanishing elsewhere, about gas chambers operating in nearby camps, about entire communities erased in weeks, and this knowledge shaped behavior, fueling despair for some and resistance for others, as underground networks sought to document events or prepare for potential revolt. The rhythm of Operation Reinhard intensified in 1943, culminating in actions such as Action Ernstfest, during which thousands of Jews in the Lublin region were murdered in mass shootings to prevent uprisings and eliminate remaining laborers, and Majdanek itself became a site of one of the largest single-day massacres of the Holocaust, when prisoners were executed in prepared trenches to the sound of amplified music meant to drown out gunfire. A grim demonstration that the camp's function could pivot from labor exploitation to open slaughter when ordered. Segment 1 of this chapter reveals how Majdanek operated as both component and complement within Operation Reinhard's machinery. Neither solely a work camp nor solely a death camp, but a hybrid institution reflecting the regime's evolving strategy. Kill when useful, exploit when profitable, erase when necessary. By examining administrative correspondence, transport records, survivor testimony, and post-war investigations, we see how policy and practice intertwined, how ideology translated into logistics, and how a regional initiative became one of the deadliest campaigns of the Holocaust. In understanding Majdanek's integration into Operation Reinhard, the camp emerges not as an anomaly but as evidence of a system capable of coordination on a massive scale, where local actions were guided by centralized intent, and where the destruction of entire communities was executed through organized procedure rather than spontaneous violence. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Action Ernstfest. The Harvest of Death at Majdanek. By late 1943, the Nazi leadership in the Lublin district faced a problem of its own making. Jewish prisoners still alive in labor camps posed, in their view, both a security threat and an ideological contradiction, because Operation Reinhard had been designed to eliminate Jewish communities entirely, yet thousands remained in forced labor detachments supporting the German war economy and resistance movements. Most notably the uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor had demonstrated that even in places built for death, rebellion was possible. In response, SS and police leader Odilo Globoknik, under orders aligned with Heinrich Himmler's directives, initiated a coordinated operation to murder the remaining Jewish laborers in the region, an action cynically named Action Ernstfest, Harvest Festival, a phrase that masked mass execution beneath pastoral imagery, and Majdanek became one of its principal killing sites. Preparations unfolded with deceptive calm. Trenches were dug near the camp perimeter under the pretext of air raid defenses. Loudspeakers were installed ostensibly for announcements, and units of SS, police battalions, and auxiliaries assembled with logistical precision, while prisoners continued daily routines unaware that an irrevocable decision had already been made. On November 3, 1943, Jewish inmates at Majdanek were ordered to assemble, separated from other prisoner groups, and march toward the prepared trenches, where they were forced to lie face down in layers and shot systematically, row after row, as music blasted through speakers to conceal the sound of gunfire from the rest of the camp and surrounding population. The killing did not occur in chaos but in deliberate sequence, reflecting the bureaucratic mindset that had come to define extermination policy. Lists were consulted, guards assigned positions, ammunition distributed, and the process continued hour after hour until thousands lay dead in mass graves, their belongings sorted afterward like routine inventory. Estimates placed the number murdered at Majdanek that day at approximately 18,000, making it one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust, and parallel executions occurred at nearby labor camps such as Poniatowa and Triniki, extending the operation's death toll to over 40,000 within 2 days, a scale that underscores how thoroughly extermination had been integrated into administrative capability. For prisoners forced to witness fragments of the event, those not targeted, those assigned to peripheral tasks. The psychological rupture was immediate, a recognition that survival under the logic of labor exploitation could be revoked without warning, that usefulness offered no guarantee against annihilation. For the perpetrators, reports were filed in measured language, noting completion of the action and restoration of order, demonstrating once again how euphemism insulated participants from the moral weight of what had occurred. In Majdanek's barracks after Ernefest, silence replaced the crowded murmurs that had once filled Jewish sections of the camp, and absence became as tangible as presence had been. As bunks stood empty and work details were reorganized to compensate for the sudden reduction in numbers, the massacre marked not only a brutal elimination of remaining Jewish prisoners in the Lublin district, but also a transition in Majdanek's function, signaling that the camp's role within Operation Reinhard had shifted from exploitation to consolidation, from managing labor populations to erasing them entirely when deemed expedient. Survivor testimonies later described the soundscape of that day: the relentless music, the intermittent bursts of gunfire, the smell of earth and blood, details that pierced through the bureaucratic facade and revealed the lived horror beneath administrative language. And these accounts would become essential in post-war trials, where prosecutors sought to demonstrate that Action Ernefest was not an excess of local cruelty but a coordinated, premeditated act aligned with broader policy. Segment 2 confronts this event not as an isolated atrocity but as culmination. A moment when Majdanek's dual identity as labor camp and killing center resolved decisively into mass execution, when the regime chose finality over continued exploitation, and when the machinery of Operation Reinhard revealed its capacity for concentrated violence even after many of its primary death camps had ceased operation. It also illustrates how fear of resistance influenced policy, how the specter of revolt accelerated murder rather than moderated it, and how the collapse of Germany's strategic position in the war paradoxically intensified efforts to eliminate witnesses. In the aftermath, administrative routines resumed with chilling normalcy. Roll calls continued, work assignments were issued, reports forwarded to higher authorities, demonstrating the system's ability to absorb even mass slaughter without structural disruption. By examining Action Ernefest in detail, we see Majdanek at the intersection of ideology, logistics, and panic. Ideology demanding total elimination, logistics enabling coordinated killing across multiple sites, and panic over resistance and impending military defeat prompting decisive, catastrophic action. The massacre stands as one of the clearest examples of how extermination policy evolved in response to internal calculations, revealing a regime that perceived even enslaved laborers as threats to be neutralized rather than human beings to be spared. In understanding this operation, we grasp the full severity of Majdanek's place within the Holocaust, not merely as a camp where death occurred, but as a stage upon which the regime enacted one of its most concentrated acts of violence, a harvest not of crops but of lives, executed under orders, documented in reports, and remembered through the testimony of the few who survived to speak. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Approaching Collapse. Evidence, Panic, and the Race Against Time. As 1944 advanced and the Eastern Front began to fracture under the pressure of the Soviet summer offensive, Majdanek entered its final and most unstable phase, a period marked by contradiction. The SS continued daily routines of discipline, forced labor, and punishment, yet beneath the surface a quiet urgency took hold, because the camp, unlike the more concealed extermination sites of Operation Reinhard, stood on open ground outside Lublin, visible from roads and villages, its barbed wire and watchtowers unmistakable, its crematoria and storage warehouses filled with evidence that could not easily be erased. Rumors traveled quickly through both prisoner ranks and SS quarters that the Red Army was advancing faster than expected, that front lines were collapsing in Belarus and eastern Poland, and that evacuation orders might soon arrive, and with those rumors came fear, not only among prisoners who sensed that movement could mean death marches or execution, but among Guards and administrators who understood that discovery could mean accountability. Within administrative offices, paperwork multiplied, and selective destruction began. Files were burned, inventories altered, transport records reduced, yet the sheer scale of Majdanek's infrastructure made total concealment impossible, for warehouses still contained mountains of confiscated property. Shoes, clothing, eyeglasses, sorted meticulously by type and size, physical proof of mass deportation and murder, and gas chambers and crematoria stood largely intact, grim reminders that this camp had operated as both labor center and killing facility. The SS faced a dilemma unlike that at Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka, where demolition had preceded retreat. Majdanek's size and proximity to the shifting front meant there was little time for comprehensive erasure, and the machinery of extermination remained dangerously visible. For prisoners, daily existence during these final weeks oscillated between exhaustion and anticipation, because liberation, a word whispered cautiously in barracks at night, seemed closer than ever. Yet history had taught them that hope could be fatal, and so survival instincts remained cautious, focused on securing scraps of food, avoiding punishment, and clinging to fragile networks of solidarity that had developed over years of shared suffering. Some prisoners reported hearing distant artillery, a low tremor carried on the wind, a sound that mingled with the routine clang of work details and the barked commands of guards, creating an atmosphere suspended between continuity and collapse. Meanwhile, SS personnel debated evacuation plans, which prisoners were to be marched westward, which records to prioritize for destruction, which units would remain behind to delay advancing forces, and how to manage panic without revealing weakness. Some guards deserted quietly, slipping away before orders crystallized, while others doubled down on brutality, perhaps driven by fear, perhaps by ideology, perhaps by the belief that discipline must be maintained until the final hour. The contradiction sharpened in July 1944, when Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that shattered German Army Group Center and sent shockwaves through occupied territories. Lublin fell with surprising speed, and Majdanek, positioned just outside the city, suddenly found itself on the front line of retreat rather than secure hinterland, and evacuation efforts began hastily, with selected prisoners forced onto transports or marches westward toward camps. Deeper within Germany, though the process lacked the coordination seen elsewhere because time was running out. Equipment was dismantled where possible, but much remained, and as Soviet troops approached, SS units withdrew in stages, some attempting to destroy key facilities, others abandoning posts abruptly, leaving behind structures, documents, and physical traces that would soon become evidence. What distinguishes Majdanek in this moment is not only the scale of suffering already endured, but the fact that it was captured largely intact. When Red Army soldiers entered the camp on July 23, 1944, they encountered barracks still standing, crematoria not yet demolished, gas chambers with residues visible, and storerooms filled with belongings taken from murdered prisoners, an unprecedented discovery that contradicted later claims that extermination sites were merely rumors or fabrications. Majdanek became one of the first major concentration camps liberated by Allied forces, and the immediacy of its evidence allowed journalists, photographers, and investigators to document crimes while the war was still ongoing, transforming the camp from hidden instrument of terror into visible proof of genocide. For surviving prisoners left behind during the hurried evacuation, liberation did not immediately erase trauma or suffering, because disease, malnutrition, and psychological shock persisted, and Soviet medics faced the urgent task of providing food and medical care while preventing the dangers of refeeding syndrome that had claimed lives in other liberated camps. Yet amid exhaustion, there was also the fragile beginning of testimony, as survivors described forced labor in quarries and factories, mass shootings during Action Erntefest, selections for gas chambers, and the bureaucratic order that had governed every aspect of daily terror. Segment 3 closes this chapter at the threshold between occupation and exposure. Majdanek, once designed as a node within a vast network of concealment and efficiency, now stood revealed, its physical presence undermining attempts at denial, its incomplete destruction exposing the limits of SS control in the face of rapid military collapse. In the space of days, the camp transitioned from functioning instrument of oppression to site of evidence, and that transition reshaped how the world would come to understand the Holocaust, because here, unlike camps demolished in retreat, the architecture of murder remained silent but unmistakable, bearing witness to a system that had relied on secrecy, distance, and time, none of which it possessed in its final hours. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Liberation and Immediate Aftermath. When Soviet forces entered Majdanek in July 1944, they did not arrive at a battlefield in the traditional sense, nor at a fortress braced for siege, but at a sprawling complex of barbed wire, guard towers, barracks, crematoria, warehouses, and silence. A silence broken only by wind across open fields and the faint movements of those who had survived long enough to witness the camp's sudden abandonment. Unlike other extermination sites that had been dismantled in secrecy before Allied forces could reach them, Majdanek stood largely intact. The SS had attempted partial destruction, but the speed of the Soviet advance left little time for thorough concealment. What the soldiers encountered was not rumor, not fragment, not ashes scattered beyond recognition. It was evidence. Buildings remained. Gas chambers remained. Crematoria ovens remained. And in warehouses, stacked in staggering numbers, were shoes, clothing, eyeglasses, personal belongings sorted with bureaucratic precision. The system had not vanished. It had been interrupted. For the prisoners who remained inside the camp, liberation did not unfold as a triumphant moment. It arrived quietly, almost uncertainly. Many were too weak to stand. Typhus still spread through overcrowded barracks. Hunger had hollowed faces into bone and shadow. The physical gates may have opened, but the body does not instantly recover from years of starvation, forced labor, and fear. Soviet medics entered not as conquerors but as emergency responders, facing a humanitarian catastrophe. Thousands of severely malnourished individuals whose bodies could not safely process sudden food, whose immune systems were compromised, whose psychological trauma ran deeper than visible wounds. Care had to be measured. Rations were cautiously distributed. Field hospitals were established. Typhus wards were isolated. Survival now depended on stabilization, not celebration. The Soviet command quickly recognized the historical weight of what they had uncovered. Majdanek became one of the first major Nazi concentration and extermination camps to be liberated intact, and within days investigators, journalists, and war correspondents were escorted through its grounds. Photographs were taken of gas chambers, crematoria, and storage facilities. Reports were drafted documenting Zyklon B residues, execution trenches, and mass graves. Evidence was catalogued while the war was still ongoing. This timing mattered. It meant that documentation was not retrospective, it was immediate. The world would see Majdanek not as distant allegation but as present reality. Survivor testimony began almost at once. Prisoners described forced labor details, the November 1943 massacre known as Action Erntefest, daily selections for death, starvation rations, and the relentless structure of camp discipline. They explained how bureaucracy masked brutality, how transport lists translated into disappearance, how numbers replaced names, how punishment was administered through routine rather than rage. Their accounts provided context to the physical evidence surrounding them. The camp was not chaos. It had been organized, efficient, scheduled. Yet liberation also exposed complexity. Some prisoners had been evacuated days earlier on forced marches toward camps deeper inside Germany. Others had been left behind because they were too sick to move. Families remained separated. The front lines continued shifting westward, meaning that safety was relative and temporary. Even in freedom, uncertainty persisted. The Soviet authorities soon established a commission to investigate crimes committed at Majdanek. Excavations began at suspected burial sites. Forensic examinations were conducted. Documents recovered from administrative offices were analyzed. In the broader political context, Majdanek also became a symbol, proof used to demonstrate the scale of Nazi atrocities to both domestic and international audiences. Trials would later rely heavily on documentation gathered here. But beyond legal and political consequences lay another reality: memory. For survivors, the physical presence of Majdanek posed a paradox. It was the site of their suffering, yet it was also the site of their survival. Some would later return to testify. Others could never bear to revisit it. The land itself, once a mechanism of control and extermination, now stood as silent witness. Chapter 8 begins not with victory, but with exposure. The collapse of SS authority at Majdanek did not erase what had occurred within its fences. Instead, it preserved it, and in that preservation lay a turning point, the moment when the machinery of genocide was forced into the open, where the world could no longer claim ignorance, and where the system that thrived on secrecy began to unravel under the weight of its own evidence. Chapter 8, Segment 2: Documentation, Trials, and the Struggle for Accountability. In the weeks and months following the liberation of Majdanek, the camp transitioned from a site of confinement to a site of investigation, and the urgency that once fueled the machinery of imprisonment was replaced by an equally determined effort to record, preserve, and prosecute what had occurred there. Soviet authorities moved quickly, aware that the advancing front lines and the shifting political landscape could complicate evidence collection. What distinguished Majdanek from many other camps was not only the scale of atrocity, but the extraordinary amount of physical proof left behind. Administrative offices still contained files, transport lists, guard rosters, and supply records. Gas chambers remained standing, their walls stained and chemically tested for traces of Zyklon B. Crematoria ovens were intact. Barracks, watchtowers, fences, the architecture of systematic control, stood largely undestroyed. Even the warehouses filled with confiscated belongings, thousands upon thousands of shoes, garments, suitcases, and personal effects, provided tangible confirmation of mass deportation and death. Unlike extermination camps that had been dismantled or leveled in retreat, Majdanek confronted investigators with visibility. The system had failed to erase itself. The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission began formal inquiries almost immediately. Forensic teams exhumed burial pits and documented remains. Witness testimonies were taken from surviving prisoners, local residents, and even captured German personnel. These early testimonies described daily life inside the camp with chilling consistency. Roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing conditions, starvation rations measured to sustain labor but not life, punishments delivered publicly to instill fear, and selections that determined who would live another week and who would be sent to execution sites or gas chambers. Survivors spoke of Action Erntefest, the mass shooting operation in November 1943 that resulted in the murder of tens of thousands of Jews within days. They described the sound of gunfire echoing across trenches, the forced burial of bodies, and the psychological terror of witnessing extermination on such a scale. These statements were transcribed, archived, and compared against physical findings. Majdanek soon became the setting for one of the earliest war crimes trials conducted by Soviet authorities. In late 1944, only months after liberation, several former SS guards and camp officials were brought before a military tribunal in Lublin. The speed of the proceedings reflected both the urgency of justice and the political context of the time. The trials were public. Evidence was displayed. Witnesses testified directly about cruelty, beatings, executions, and participation in extermination processes. Defendants attempted various defenses, claiming obedience to orders, limited responsibility, ignorance of larger policies, but the presence of documentation and survivor testimony made denial difficult. Sentences were delivered swiftly, including death penalties for several of the accused. For the Soviet Union, these trials served multiple purposes. They punished perpetrators, documented crimes for historical record, and reinforced the narrative of fascist brutality exposed through liberation. Yet accountability did not end with these early proceedings. As the war concluded and Allied powers convened to address the broader scope of Nazi criminality, Majdanek's evidence contributed to international prosecutions. Documentation from the camp was referenced in post-war trials across Europe. Former camp personnel who had fled or concealed their identities were later tracked down in West Germany, Austria, and beyond. Decades after liberation, investigations continued, sometimes reopening cases as new testimony or archival material emerged. The legal pursuit of justice was uneven and often incomplete, but Majdanek's preserved state ensured that denial could not easily take root. At the same time, survivors faced their own complex reckoning. Many were displaced, unable or unwilling to return to homes that had been destroyed or confiscated. Some emigrated to new countries, carrying with them memories that would shape families and communities for generations. Others participated in early documentation projects, understanding that testimony was both personal catharsis and collective responsibility. The preservation of Majdanek as a memorial site began relatively early compared to other camps. Its barracks, crematoria, and fields were maintained not as relics of triumph, but as warnings. Visitors could walk the same paths prisoners once marched, stand inside gas chambers that had not been dismantled, and confront the material evidence of bureaucratized murder. The struggle for accountability also involved confronting misconceptions. For years after the war, some narratives minimized the scale of crimes at camps without the notoriety of Auschwitz. Majdanek's relative proximity to civilian areas and its rapid liberation complicated assumptions about secrecy. How could such a place operate so close to a major city? What did local populations know? Investigations explored these uncomfortable questions, examining complicity, silence, fear, and the normalization of brutality under authoritarian rule. Accountability was not only about SS officers. It extended into systems of collaboration, industrial partnerships, and administrative networks that had enabled the camp to function. Chapter 8, Segment 2 traces this difficult path from exposure to prosecution, from evidence to memory. Liberation did not automatically produce justice. It required documentation, testimony, legal process, and persistence across decades. Majdanek became one of the earliest and clearest cases in which the Nazi camp system was confronted in court while the physical structures still stood. The camp that the Nazis failed to hide became a foundation for proving how genocide operated, not through chaos, but through records, orders, and organized intent. And in that transformation, Majdanek shifted from a place of controlled terror to a place where truth, however painful, could be seen, studied, and preserved for the generations that followed. Chapter 8, Segment 3. Memory, Denial, and the Responsibility of Witness. After the trials ended and the headlines faded, Majdanek did not disappear into silence. It remained where it had always stood, on the outskirts of Lublin, visible against the horizon, its watchtowers still cutting into the sky. Unlike camps that had been dismantled or reduced to forest and field, Majdanek confronted post-war Europe with something far more difficult than ruins: presence. The barracks were still there. The crematoria ovens were still intact. The gas chambers could still be entered. The ash pits remained. This physical survival meant that memory at Majdanek would never rely solely on testimony. It relied on architecture, on space, on objects that refused to decay quickly enough to allow comfortable forgetting. And yet, even with such overwhelming evidence, the struggle over memory began almost immediately. In the years following the war, Europe faced reconstruction, political realignment, and the emerging tension of the Cold War. Attention shifted, priorities shifted, survivors rebuilt lives in new countries. Many remained silent, not because the past was unclear, but because it was unbearable to retell. Trauma often speaks in fragments, not full narratives. And so the responsibility of remembrance fell not only on individuals, but on institutions willing to preserve what had happened there. Majdanek became one of the first former concentration camps to be turned into a state museum. This decision was not accidental. Its near-intact condition made it a powerful site of education. Visitors could see the rows of barracks stretching into the distance, walk past fences once electrified, and stand before the crematorium where bodies had been reduced to ash. Exhibits displayed thousands of shoes taken from murdered prisoners, leather hardened with time, children's sizes placed beside adult boots. These objects were not abstract symbols. They were remnants of individual lives interrupted. In preserving them, curators made a deliberate choice to present the Holocaust not as distant history, but as documented reality. Every photograph, every list of names, every preserved structure served as evidence against denial. But denial, subtle and overt, emerged nonetheless. In various parts of the world, individuals and groups attempted to minimize or distort the crimes committed in camps like Majdanek. Some questioned numbers. Others suggested exaggeration. A few denied the existence of gas chambers entirely, despite chemical analysis and physical remains. In response, historians, archivists, and educators returned again and again to the site itself. The walls could be tested. The architectural plans could be compared to testimonies. The documents bearing SS signatures remained in archives. Majdanek's failure to be destroyed became its greatest defense against historical falsification. It stood as proof that genocide had not been rumor or propaganda. It had been constructed, administered, and carried out in specific buildings by identifiable people under recorded orders. Over time, remembrance expanded beyond prosecution and preservation. It entered public education. School groups visited the grounds. Survivors guided tours when health allowed. Scholars published research based on camp records. The story of Majdanek became integrated into broader understanding of Operation Reinhard and the Holocaust in occupied Poland. Each generation faced the same question: how to teach horror without sensationalizing it, how to preserve accuracy without overwhelming those who encounter it for the first time. The goal was never to shock for its own sake. It was to explain how ordinary systems, railways, paperwork, construction projects, supply chains, could be assembled into instruments of annihilation. Majdanek demonstrated that genocide did not always hide in remote secrecy. Sometimes it operated in view of a city, under the logic of war economy and racial policy. For survivors, memory carried personal dimensions that no museum display could capture. Many returned decades later, standing on ground where they had once stood as prisoners. Some searched for the barack in which they had slept, the yard where roll calls had been held, the place where a friend had disappeared. Memory at Majdanek is layered. Institutional memory preserved in archives, national memory shaped by commemoration, and individual memory carried in the minds of those who endured it. These layers do not always align perfectly, but together they form a record resistant to erasure. Majdanek also compels reflection beyond its specific geography. It raises questions about proximity and indifference. How did such a camp operate so near to civilian neighborhoods? What did people hear, see, or suspect? What pressures silenced them? The answers are complex, involving fear, propaganda, coercion, and survival under occupation. Yet the question itself remains relevant. Mass atrocity rarely begins with camps. It begins with ideology, with dehumanizing language, with incremental normalization of exclusion. By the time fences rise and barracks fill, the groundwork has already been laid. Chapter 8, Segment 3 closes not with spectacle, but with responsibility. Majdanek survived the war physically. The greater challenge has been ensuring it survives in understanding. To walk its grounds today is to confront the reality that the system nearly succeeded in hiding itself, but not entirely. Evidence endured. Testimony endured. The camp the Nazis failed to hide became one of the clearest reminders that truth can outlast terror, if preserved carefully and defended persistently. Remembering Majdanek is not about dwelling in darkness. It is about recognizing how systems are built, and how vigilance, education, and moral courage remain the only safeguards against their return. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The human faces behind the system. By the time Majdanek entered its final year of operation, it had already processed tens of thousands of human lives through its gates. Numbers appear often in historical summaries, figures representing deportations, deaths, transfers, and executions. But behind each number was a name, and behind each name, a story that began long before barbed wire and watchtowers. To understand Majdanek fully, it is not enough to examine administrative structures or architectural layouts. One must also look at the individuals who were forced into its system, people whose lives had been shaped by culture, profession, faith, family, and community long before the war disrupted everything. Prisoners arrived from across occupied Europe. Jews from Polish towns and cities were deported in waves, often after surviving the confinement of ghettos. Soviet prisoners of war, captured during Operation Barbarossa, were transported under brutal conditions, many already weakened by starvation and exposure. Political prisoners, Poles involved in resistance movements, teachers, priests, lawyers, and students, were arrested for defying occupation or suspected of opposition. Roma families, labeled as racially undesirable, were rounded up and deported as entire units. Each transport represented not only displacement but disintegration of entire communities. For Jewish deportees, the journey to Majdanek often followed months or years of incremental deprivation. Many had already endured overcrowded ghettos, ration cards that barely sustained life, forced labor details, and public humiliation. When the trains arrived at the camp, exhaustion blurred the line between fear and disbelief. The sight of barbed wire and guard towers confirmed that whatever awaited them would not resemble survival in any recognizable sense. Upon arrival, selections divided those deemed capable of labor from those considered too weak or too young. Families were separated in moments that lasted seconds but altered lives permanently. Children clung to parents. Elderly relatives struggled to understand orders shouted in German. Confusion was intentional. Speed was intentional. Efficiency required emotional disorientation. Soviet prisoners of war faced a particularly lethal fate at Majdanek. Classified as ideological enemies of the Reich, many were denied even the limited protections sometimes extended to Western Allied prisoners. They arrived in ragged uniforms, often without adequate clothing for Polish winters. Barracks overflowed beyond capacity. Food distributions barely registered as sustenance. Mortality among Soviet POWs soared rapidly. Some were executed outright. Others succumbed to starvation or disease within weeks. Their deaths were rarely recorded with individual detail, subsumed into broader administrative categories. Yet they represented a significant portion of those who perished in the camp's early phases. Political prisoners brought with them a different burden: awareness. Many understood the ideological framework driving the camp system. Resistance fighters from underground networks had already risked arrest knowing the consequences. Within Majdanek, Some attempted to maintain covert lines of communication, sharing information between barracks, preserving fragments of organization even under surveillance. Acts of resistance could be as small as sharing extra bread or as bold as documenting conditions secretly for future testimony. Survival required caution. Defiance required calculation. Punishment for discovery was immediate and severe. Women prisoners experienced Majdanek under specific vulnerabilities. They were subjected not only to forced labor and starvation, but also to sexual exploitation and humiliation. Mothers arriving with children faced unbearable choices when selections separated families. The camp system did not differentiate between maternal instinct and ideological policy. Women worked in sorting depots, agricultural details, or construction tasks, often while battling illness and malnutrition. Some formed mutual aid groups, pooling resources to keep one another alive through winter months. These fragile networks of solidarity became lifelines in an environment designed to isolate. Children within Majdanek occupied a particularly tragic space. Too young for sustained labor, too numerous to ignore, they existed in a limbo shaped by policy shifts. Some were deported onward to extermination sites. Others perished from disease or hunger. A few survived through concealment or protection by adult prisoners who risked punishment to shield them. Survivor testimonies decades later often returned to memories of children's faces in the barracks. Small figures navigating spaces built for industrial confinement. Their presence underscored the indiscriminate nature of the system. Medical experiments conducted at Majdanek added another layer of suffering. Selected prisoners were subjected to procedures without consent, framed under the guise of scientific research. These acts were not spontaneous cruelty. They were integrated into institutional objectives, rationalized as contributions to war effort or racial science. Victims bore physical scars long after liberation, alongside psychological trauma that often remained unspoken for years. Despite the brutality, moments of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared whispered prayers, fragments of poetry, and memories of home. Cultural identity became resistance in itself. A teacher might recite a lesson quietly to younger prisoners. A musician might hum a melody remembered from childhood. These gestures did not dismantle the system, but they challenged its attempt to reduce individuals to labor units. Chapter 9 begins by restoring these human dimensions. Majdanek was a system, yes, but systems operate upon people. Understanding the camp requires acknowledging the multiplicity of those who passed through it. Jews from Lublin and Warsaw, Soviet soldiers captured on distant fronts, Polish resistance fighters, Roma families uprooted from villages, children whose names were recorded only in fragments. Their experiences differed in detail but converged in suffering structured by policy. The history of Majdanek is not solely about buildings and directives. It is about lives interrupted, communities dismantled, and resilience expressed in quiet defiance. As we move forward, the focus remains not only on how the camp functioned, but on whom it affected, and how their testimonies continue to shape our understanding of what occurred within those fences. Chapter 9, Segment 2: Survival, Memory, and the Weight of Witness. As Majdanek moved toward its final months of operation, the camp's population reflected the layered brutality of years of policy, deportation, and shifting wartime priorities. Those who remained alive by 1944 were not merely prisoners. They were witnesses in progress, people who had endured starvation, forced labor, selections, disease, and the constant unpredictability of command decisions. Survival inside Majdanek did not follow a single path. It was shaped by chance, health, labor assignments, connections with other prisoners, and sometimes by small moments of timing that separated life from death by minutes. For many inmates, endurance depended on securing work details that, while exhausting, offered slightly better access to food or shelter. Kitchen assignments, warehouse sorting, agricultural units, or workshops could mean proximity to scraps of sustenance or temporary protection from the harshest outdoor conditions. Labor did not guarantee survival, but idleness often ensured vulnerability. Those too weak to work faced transfer, execution, or death by neglect. The camp system equated productivity with temporary utility. Once that utility faded, so did protection. Disease remained a constant and escalating threat. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and malnutrition-related illnesses swept through overcrowded barracks. Medical facilities within the camp were limited and often functioned less as centers of care and more as holding areas for those unlikely to recover. In some cases, the sick were selected for execution under the rationale of maintaining efficiency. Hygiene was nearly impossible in conditions where water, soap, and clean clothing were scarce. Lice thrived. Fever spread. Weak bodies succumbed quickly. Yet survival was not defined solely by physical endurance. Psychological resilience played a profound role. Prisoners developed coping mechanisms, mental routines that helped structure days when official timekeeping meant little. Some counted steps between barracks. Others memorized poems, reconstructed books from memory, or silently rehearsed conversations with loved ones left behind. Maintaining identity became essential. The system attempted to reduce individuals to numbers stitched onto uniforms, but internal narratives resisted that reduction. Networks of mutual aid emerged despite surveillance. Prisoners from similar towns or political backgrounds sometimes formed quiet alliances. A stronger inmate might shield a weaker one during roll call inspections. Food portions were occasionally redistributed among trusted companions. Information circulated discreetly, rumors of advancing Allied forces, reports from other camps, whispers about shifting German strategy. Knowledge itself offered a form of psychological sustenance, suggesting that the outside world had not vanished entirely. As the war turned against Germany, the atmosphere inside Majdanek shifted in subtle ways. Guards appeared more anxious. Orders changed abruptly. Some administrative records were destroyed. Evidence of mass executions was concealed or hurriedly buried. The machinery of the camp continued, but uncertainty permeated its rhythm. Prisoners sensed that something beyond the fences was changing, though few could predict how quickly events would unfold. When Soviet forces approached in July 1944, Majdanek became one of the first major concentration camps encountered largely intact. Unlike other sites that the SS evacuated or demolished before liberation, Majdanek's infrastructure remained visible. Barracks, crematoria, gas chambers, warehouses filled with confiscated belongings, all stood as evidence. For prisoners still alive, liberation arrived not as a single triumphant moment, but as a complex transition from confinement to survival in a devastated landscape. Many were too weak to comprehend freedom immediately. Malnourished bodies required medical intervention. Soviet medics attempted to stabilize the sick, distribute food carefully, and prevent fatal complications such as refeeding syndrome. Survivors staggered through open gates into a world both familiar and unrecognizable. Homes had been destroyed. Families were missing. Entire communities had been erased. For those who survived, the responsibility of memory began almost immediately. Investigators documented the site. Photographs were taken. Testimonies were recorded. Majdanek's relative preservation allowed early documentation of Nazi crimes, shaping post-war understanding of the camp system. Survivors recounted details of labor routines, selections, executions, and daily life. Their words provided context to physical evidence. Without their accounts, the buildings alone would have spoken only partially. Post-war years brought trials and legal proceedings. Some camp personnel were prosecuted. Evidence gathered at Majdanek contributed to broader war crimes investigations. Yet justice unfolded unevenly. Not every perpetrator faced consequences. Not every survivor received recognition or support. Memory carried weight, sometimes heavy enough to silence those who bore it. For decades, Majdanek stood as a memorial site. Grass grew where barracks once overflowed. Monuments were erected. Visitors walked through preserved structures, confronting the scale of suffering that had occurred within ordinary architectural lines. Survivors returned occasionally, guiding tours, speaking to students, ensuring that abstraction never replaced reality. Their presence transformed history into lived testimony. Chapter 9 continues by examining not only how individuals endured Majdanek, but how their survival reshaped historical consciousness. Memory did not emerge automatically. It required documentation, education, and the willingness of societies to confront uncomfortable truths. The camp's existence challenges narratives that reduce atrocity to isolated madness. Majdanek functioned as part of a coordinated system, one that relied on bureaucrats, guards, railway schedules, engineers, and ordinary administrative routines. The human faces behind that system, those who suffered and those who testified, remain central to understanding it. Survival stories illuminate both fragility and resilience. They remind us that even within structures designed for annihilation, individuals preserved fragments of humanity. In preserving those fragments, they ensured that Majdanek could not vanish into obscurity. As we move toward the final segment of this chapter, the focus shifts from survival and testimony to the broader implications of remembrance. What does it mean for a camp to remain visible? What responsibility follows liberation? And how does a site of suffering transform into a place of education and warning for future generations? Chapter 9, Segment 3. Reckoning, Justice, and the Long Shadow of Majdanek. When the gates of Majdanek stood open in the summer of 1944, liberation did not end the story of the camp. It began another chapter, one defined by reckoning. The world had not yet fully grasped the scale of what had occurred across occupied Europe, but Majdanek offered something rare and undeniable: evidence left behind in place. Barracks still stood. Crematoria remained intact. Warehouses were filled with shoes, clothing, suitcases, and personal belongings. The machinery of persecution had not been completely dismantled. It was visible, tangible, documented. Soviet investigators moved quickly. Photographs were taken of gas chambers, ovens, mass graves, and storehouses of confiscated property. Witnesses were interviewed while memories were fresh and wounds still raw. Doctors examined survivors to record the effects of starvation and disease. The camp became one of the earliest major sites where the outside world could confront the physical infrastructure of genocide. Unlike camps that had been evacuated and destroyed before Allied arrival, Majdanek stood as a preserved crime scene. But evidence alone does not create justice. In the months and years that followed, the challenge shifted from documentation to accountability. Trials were organized to prosecute those responsible for crimes committed within the camp. Some SS guards, administrators, and collaborators were identified and charged. Courtrooms attempted to translate suffering into legal language: counts, charges, testimony, verdicts. Survivors were asked to relive their experiences under oath, describing selections, forced labor, executions, and daily brutality. The process was uneven. Some perpetrators were convicted. Others escaped or blended into post-war society. Political divisions emerging in Europe complicated international cooperation. The Cold War altered priorities. Attention shifted from past crimes to present tensions. For many survivors, justice felt partial, incomplete, or delayed beyond recognition. Yet even imperfect trials established an important principle: that crimes committed under state authority could be judged in courts of law. Majdanek's role in early war crimes investigations influenced the broader reckoning that followed. Testimonies gathered there contributed to understanding how camps operated, not only as sites of imprisonment, but as components of a larger extermination system. The camp was linked to deportation routes, administrative offices, supply chains, and military directives. It became clear that atrocities were not spontaneous acts of chaos. They were organized, documented, and often bureaucratically recorded. As decades passed, the physical space of Majdanek transformed into a memorial and museum. Preserved barracks became exhibition halls. Artifacts were cataloged. Educational programs were developed. Visitors walked through gas chambers with an awareness shaped by historical research and survivor testimony. Silence settled differently over the grounds. Not the silence of concealment, but of reflection. For survivors, memory carried dual weight. Preserved truth, yet it also reopened trauma. Some chose to speak publicly, traveling to schools and conferences, recounting life inside the camp so that future generations would understand the consequences of hatred and indifference. Others remained quiet, carrying memories privately. Both responses were forms of survival. The camp's existence forced societies to confront uncomfortable questions. How had ordinary administrative structures enabled extraordinary cruelty? How had professionals, clerks, engineers, doctors, participated in systems that dehumanized millions? Majdanek illustrated that genocide did not require secrecy alone. It required coordination, paperwork, timetables, and obedience. Education became central to the camp's legacy. Students learned not only about dates and statistics but about mechanisms, how discrimination evolved into segregation, how segregation escalated into deportation, how deportation became extermination. The site offered a concrete reminder that systems built gradually can culminate in catastrophic outcomes. Majdanek also stands as a warning about denial. Because it was discovered largely intact, the camp's documentation challenged attempts to minimize or distort history. Photographs, architectural plans, and survivor accounts form an interlocking record. They leave little room for doubt about what occurred within its fences. Yet remembrance is not automatic. It requires continued engagement. Memorial ceremonies, research publications, archival preservation, all sustain awareness. Each generation must decide whether to confront the past or allow it to fade into abstraction. Majdanek's preserved structures speak across time, but they depend on listeners willing to hear. As Chapter 9 concludes, we recognize that the story of Majdanek did not end with liberation or even with trials. Its shadow extends into contemporary discussions about human rights, accountability, and the responsibilities of citizenship. The camp's history challenges complacency. It asks whether modern societies are attentive to warning signs, the gradual erosion of rights, the normalization of exclusion, the language that reduces people to categories rather than individuals. Majdanek was once a functioning instrument of policy. Today it is a site of memory. That transformation underscores a profound truth. Systems built to destroy can become evidence that protects. Survivors who endured its cruelty ensured that silence did not win. Their testimonies anchor historical understanding. As we move into the final chapter, we turn toward the broader legacy, how Majdanek fits within the history of the Holocaust, how it shaped legal frameworks for war crimes, and how its lessons continue to resonate. The camp stands not only as a record of suffering, but as a reminder that vigilance is necessary wherever prejudice and power intersect. Chapter 10, Segment 1. Majdanek in Historical Memory, From Crime Scene to Conscience. When the war ended and the guns fell silent across Europe, Majdanek did not disappear into rubble or ash. It remained, barracks standing against the wind, watchtowers casting long shadows across empty ground, gas chambers still marked by the stains of use. Unlike many other camps whose structures were dismantled in retreat, Majdanek endured as one of the most intact physical witnesses of the Holocaust. Its survival forced the world to confront something undeniable. Genocide had been constructed in wood, brick, wire, and stone. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, the camp functioned as both a forensic site and a symbol. Investigators cataloged buildings, photographed interiors, and measured burial pits. The physical layout revealed the organization of terror: separate zones for prisoners, storage, administration, labor workshops, and killing facilities. Majdanek demonstrated that destruction had been methodical. There was no chaos in its design. Each structure served a defined purpose within a coordinated system. As international tribunals began to examine Nazi crimes, evidence gathered from Majdanek shaped early understandings of how concentration and extermination camps operated. Testimony from survivors described daily routines: roll calls at dawn, ration distribution, forced labor assignments, selections, punishments. These accounts aligned with physical evidence, architectural blueprints, confiscated records, and surviving administrative documents. Together, they formed a narrative not of isolated brutality, but of a regulated mechanism of oppression. The preservation of Majdanek allowed historians to trace connections outward. Transport lists linked the camp to ghettos in Poland and beyond. Correspondence connected local administrators to higher SS offices. Supplies arriving at the camp, barbed wire, Zyklon B, uniforms, tools were documented in procurement forms. Majdanek stood as proof that genocide had relied not only on ideology but on infrastructure. Railways delivered prisoners. Bureaucrats processed paperwork. Factories consumed labor. The camp was a node within a network. Over time, the site transformed into a memorial institution. Exhibitions were installed within former barracks. Artifacts, suitcases, shoes, letters were preserved behind glass. Educational guides led visitors through gas chambers and crematoria, explaining how these spaces functioned. The purpose shifted from investigation to remembrance. Yet the weight of evidence remained visible in every beam and pathway. For survivors returning to Majdanek decades later, the experience was complex. Some found closure in seeing the camp recognized as a place of truth rather than denial. Others felt renewed grief walking through spaces where suffering had defined every hour. Memory does not age in a straight line. It resurfaces unexpectedly, carried by scent, sound, or silence. Majdanek also entered global consciousness through scholarship. Historians analyzed its role within Operation Reinhard and the broader camp system. They examined how the camp evolved, from an initial prisoner of war facility to a site combining forced labor and mass murder. Studies explored the hierarchy of guards, the classification of prisoners, and the economics of confiscated property. Each research project added dimension to understanding how terror became normalized. The camp's survival challenged narratives that portrayed genocide as hidden beyond comprehension. Visitors could stand in the gas chambers and confront physical reality. They could trace the distance from barracks to crematorium. They could imagine the crowded roll calls in freezing wind. Majdanek became an educational landscape, illustrating how discrimination escalated step by step into extermination. Public remembrance ceremonies reinforced this transformation. Candles were lit at anniversaries of liberation. Names of victims were recited. Religious leaders offered prayers. Governments acknowledged responsibility and committed to historical education. Through ritual and scholarship alike, Majdanek shifted from a tool of dehumanization to a monument of warning. Yet preservation is not neutral. It requires choices about what to display, what to emphasize, and how to narrate events. Curators faced the challenge of presenting horror without sensationalism, truth without exploitation. Exhibits were designed to convey context, explaining anti-Semitic laws, occupation policies, and wartime decisions that funneled thousands into the camp's gates. The goal became not only to document suffering, but to explain how such suffering was engineered. Majdanek's story intersects with broader discussions of memory in Europe and beyond. Post-war generations grappled with responsibility, collaboration, and silence. Communities once living near the camp confronted questions about knowledge and complicity. How much had neighbors seen? What rumors had circulated? History demanded reflection not only from perpetrators but from societies as a whole. In academic circles, Majdanek contributed to evolving definitions of genocide and crimes against humanity. Its evidence informed legal frameworks used in later international tribunals. The principle that state-organized persecution could be prosecuted as a crime under international law gained traction partly because sites like Majdanek provided undeniable proof. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the urgency of memory intensified. Survivors aged. First-hand testimony became rarer. Digital archives expanded to preserve interviews, documents, and photographs. Virtual tours allowed students worldwide to explore the camp remotely. Majdanek entered classrooms across continents, its lessons translated into multiple languages. The preserved grounds also speak in quieter ways. Grass now grows where prisoners once stood for hours. Birds nest in watchtowers that once symbolized surveillance. The landscape holds tension between natural renewal and historical permanence. Visitors often remark on this contrast, the calm of the present against the violence of the past. Majdanek remains a site that resists abstraction. Its buildings stand not as metaphors but as material fact. They remind us that systems of exclusion and extermination are constructed deliberately. They require participation, compliance, and often indifference. Understanding this process is central to preventing its repetition. Chapter 10 begins, therefore, not with an ending but with reflection. Majdanek's physical endurance ensures that history cannot easily be erased. It challenges each generation to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, obedience, and the consequences of unchecked hatred. As we continue, we will examine how Majdanek fits into the broader narrative of the Holocaust's memory, how its preservation influences collective conscience, and why its lessons remain essential in a world still wrestling with prejudice and power. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Justice, Trials, and the Struggle for Accountability. When Majdanek was liberated, the horror was undeniable. Barracks stood open to the sky. Gas chambers remained intact. Warehouses still held the belongings of the murdered. The camp was not a rumor. It was a crime scene preserved in plain sight. And yet, proving what had happened inside its fences would not be simple. Justice requires more than outrage. It demands evidence, testimony, law, and the difficult work of accountability. In the months following liberation, investigators moved carefully through the campgrounds. They documented structures, photographed execution sites, and collected administrative records left behind. The presence of intact gas chambers provided direct physical proof of extermination methods. Crematoria equipment was examined. Burial pits were measured. The scale of death was reconstructed not only from survivor testimony, but from material fact. Early trials of Nazi officials drew on evidence from camps like Majdanek. Prosecutors sought to establish responsibility not only for individual acts of violence, but for participation in a system designed for persecution and murder. The legal challenge was immense. Many perpetrators claimed they had followed orders. Others insisted they had played minor roles within a vast bureaucracy. The question facing the courts was profound. How should law respond when cruelty is embedded within state policy? The Nuremberg trials set important precedents. Crimes against humanity and genocide were articulated as punishable offenses under international law. Although Majdanek was not the sole focus of those early proceedings, documentation from the camp contributed to the broader case that the Nazi regime had engineered systematic mass murder. The very existence of Majdanek contradicted claims that atrocities were isolated or exaggerated. In later years, specific trials addressed crimes committed at Majdanek. Witnesses traveled to courtrooms to recount what they had endured. They described selections, forced labor, starvation, shootings, and gassings. For many survivors, testifying required reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Yet their voices became central to establishing historical truth. The legal process revealed the complexity of camp administration. Guards, doctors, clerks, and commanders all held defined roles. Some signed transport orders. Others supervised labor details. Some conducted selections. The structure demonstrated that genocide relied on coordination. Courts increasingly recognized that participation in such a system carried responsibility, even if individuals did not personally commit every act of violence. Yet justice was uneven. Many perpetrators escaped prosecution in the chaos of post-war Europe. Some reintegrated into civilian life. Others fled abroad. Political tensions during the emerging Cold War complicated efforts to pursue every case. The pursuit of accountability stretched across decades, and for many victims, justice felt incomplete. The Majdanek trials held in Germany during the 1970s marked a renewed effort to confront crimes long deferred. Evidence gathered earlier was revisited. Survivors once again testified. The proceedings were lengthy and emotionally charged. Public attention shifted back to a camp that some had hoped to forget. Newspapers covered the testimonies in detail, forcing a new generation to grapple with what had occurred. These trials carried significance beyond verdicts. They signaled that memory would not fade quietly. They reinforced the principle that time does not erase responsibility. Even decades later, individuals could be held accountable for their actions within a genocidal system. The courtroom became an extension of the memorial, another arena where truth was preserved. Internationally, Majdanek influenced broader human rights discourse. The legal frameworks shaped by Holocaust prosecutions informed later tribunals addressing crimes in other regions of the world. The concept that state-sponsored persecution could be judged by international standards took root partly because camps like Majdanek had demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of unchecked power. Justice, however, extends beyond trials. It includes recognition, restitution, and education. Survivors sought acknowledgement of suffering, the return of stolen property where possible, and support for rebuilding lives fractured by imprisonment. Memorial institutions collaborated with historians and legal scholars to ensure documentation remained accessible for future research. The presence of Majdanek as a preserved site reinforced legal conclusions. It stood as silent corroboration of witness accounts. Judges, journalists, and visitors could walk through the same spaces described in testimony. The material environment strengthened credibility in ways abstract records could not. As decades passed, new questions emerged about how to balance legal accountability with historical complexity. How should societies confront the fact that many perpetrators were ordinary citizens? How should law address crimes committed under authoritarian pressure? Majdanek's history offered no simple answers, but it underscored the necessity of confronting these dilemmas openly. For survivors, the meaning of justice varied. Some felt relief in seeing convictions handed down. Others believed no sentence could equal the magnitude of loss. Many emphasized that remembrance itself was a form of justice, that ensuring future generations understood what happened was as vital as punishment. Educational programs increasingly incorporated legal history into Holocaust studies. Students examined court transcripts, studied definitions of genocide, and analyzed the evolution of international law. Majdanek became part of this curriculum, illustrating how evidence transforms memory into documented history. The struggle for accountability also extended into debates about denial. As fringe voices attempted to distort or minimize the Holocaust, preserved sites and trial records provided powerful counterarguments. Majdanek's documentation stood against revisionism. Its physical presence refuted claims that atrocities were exaggerated. Justice in the context of Majdanek is therefore layered. It encompasses criminal trials, historical scholarship, public memorialization, and ongoing vigilance against distortion. Each layer contributes to a broader commitment that crimes of such magnitude must not dissolve into obscurity. As we continue this final chapter, the focus shifts toward legacy. Beyond the courtroom and memorial, what does Majdanek mean for contemporary society? How do its lessons inform current understandings of authority, prejudice, and civic responsibility? The next segment will examine how memory evolves over generations, and why the story of Majdanek remains essential not only to the past, but to the present. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Memory, Responsibility, and the Warning That Remains. The gates of Majdanek no longer confine prisoners. The watchtowers no longer scan the horizon for escape. The barbed wire stands quiet beneath open sky, yet silence does not mean absence. The camp remains, not as a functioning instrument of terror, but as a presence that asks questions no generation can avoid. Majdanek endures because it was not erased. The Nazis failed to hide it. They did not have time to dismantle its structures or burn its archives completely. As a result, the world inherited something rare in the history of genocide: a largely intact crime scene. The gas chambers still stand. The crematoria remain. The barracks stretch in long lines across open fields. The evidence is physical, unambiguous, impossible to dismiss. But preservation alone does not guarantee understanding. Memory requires effort. It requires context. It requires the willingness to look directly at what happened and to ask how such a system could function within a modern society. Majdanek was not medieval. It was not ancient. It was built in the 20th century, in an industrial nation with universities, factories, newspapers, and railroads. Its existence forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about progress, technology, and morality. For decades after the war, survivors carried the memory in their own bodies. They remembered the cold floors of the barracks, the weight of forced labor, the sound of roll calls that lasted for hours, the smell of smoke drifting from the crematoria. Many struggled to speak about it. Some could not. Trauma does not fade with liberation. It lingers, often in silence. As years passed, a new responsibility emerged. The generation that experienced Majdanek directly began to diminish. Memory had to move from personal testimony to historical record. Museums expanded their exhibitions. Scholars compiled documents. Educators developed curricula. The task shifted from witnessing to teaching. Walking through Majdanek today is an experience unlike visiting many other former camps. The landscape is open. The city of Lublin lies nearby. Modern buildings are visible beyond the perimeter. The proximity between past and present feels immediate. There is no forested isolation to soften the confrontation. The camp exists within view of daily life, reminding visitors that atrocity can occur alongside ordinary routines. Memorials mark sites of execution and burial. A vast mausoleum houses ashes collected after liberation. The structure stands solemn and stark, containing the remains of thousands. Visitors move quietly through these spaces. There are no dramatic recreations, no theatrical embellishments. The authenticity of the site carries its own weight. Yet memory is not static. It evolves with each generation. Young visitors arrive without direct connection to the war. For them, Majdanek can seem distant, part of a history textbook. The challenge lies in bridging that distance without resorting to spectacle. The story must be told with clarity and honesty, grounded in documented fact, respectful of suffering, and resistant to simplification. Majdanek teaches that genocide was not spontaneous chaos. It was organized. It relied on administrative decisions, transportation schedules, construction contracts, and supply chains. It required individuals who chose to participate, who signed forms, guarded gates, and enforced orders. The lesson is not that evil is mythical. It is that systems can normalize cruelty when moral boundaries erode. This recognition extends beyond one camp or one era. The preservation of Majdanek contributes to broader conversations about human rights and the prevention of mass violence. International institutions reference Holocaust history when crafting conventions against genocide. Scholars study the camp's records to understand mechanisms of persecution. The past informs present vigilance. At the same time, memory carries emotional dimensions. For descendants of victims, Majdanek represents absence. Lives interrupted, families fractured, futures erased. For descendants of perpetrators, it may represent a difficult inheritance requiring reflection and responsibility. The site becomes a space where multiple histories intersect. Commemoration ceremonies take place annually. Candles are lit. Names are read aloud. Silence is observed. These rituals do not change what happened. They affirm that what happened matters. They resist indifference. In recent years, digital archives have expanded access to Majdanek's documentation. Researchers around the world can examine transport lists, administrative memos, and survivor testimonies. Technology now serves preservation rather than destruction. This reversal underscores the importance of intentional stewardship. Tools can be used to harm or to remember. The warning embedded in Majdanek is subtle but persistent. It does not shout. It does not rely on dramatic imagery. It asks quieter questions. How does prejudice become policy? How does bureaucracy mask brutality? How do ordinary people rationalize participation in systems that harm others? These questions extend beyond the boundaries of one historical episode. Education remains central to the camp's legacy. Teachers who bring students to Majdanek emphasize critical thinking. They encourage analysis of primary sources. They discuss the broader context of Nazi ideology and wartime occupation. The goal is not to instill despair, but awareness. Understanding how the Holocaust happened equips future generations to recognize early signs of dehumanization elsewhere. Majdanek also challenges myths about concealment. Unlike camps that were dismantled, this one stands largely intact. The Nazis could not erase it in time. The visibility of the site counters narratives of denial, proves that attempts to bury truth can fail. As this documentary reaches its conclusion, the image of Majdanek remains steady. Barracks stretching across grass, watchtowers silhouetted against sky, the mausoleum containing ashes gathered from the earth. The structures are no longer instruments of oppression. They are witnesses. The final responsibility does not belong solely to historians or curators. It belongs to all who encounter this history. Remembering Majdanek is not an act of passive observation. It is an acknowledgement that the conditions enabling such a camp, prejudice, unchecked authority, indifference, must be recognized and resisted wherever they appear. Majdanek stands because it could not be hidden. Its survival as a place of memory transforms a site of suffering into a site of testimony. The buildings speak without voices. The ground holds stories that refuse erasure. And so we leave this chapter not with spectacle, but with clarity. Majdanek was built to confine, exploit, and kill. It failed to disappear. In its endurance lies a final truth. History can be suppressed, distorted, or ignored. But when evidence remains, memory has a foundation. The camp that the Nazis failed to hide now stands as a warning they could not silence. Majdanek was never meant to become a museum. It was never meant to be preserved. It was never meant to be seen. It was built as a machine, a place where forced labor, starvation, gas chambers, and executions operated side by side. A camp designed to function efficiently and, when necessary, to vanish without a trace. Yet when the front lines shifted in 1944, the machinery of murder was left exposed. The barracks remained. The crematoria stood. The gas chambers were still there. Majdanek did not disappear into rumor. It became evidence. What we have traced in this documentary is not only the history of one camp, but the anatomy of a system. From its construction on the outskirts of Lublin to its transformation into a center of forced labor and mass killing, Majdanek reveals how ideology became policy, how paperwork enabled cruelty, and how an industrial state organized human destruction with bureaucratic precision. But even here, inside a system designed to erase identity, humanity did not fully collapse. Prisoners shared scraps of bread. They whispered news from the outside world. They formed quiet networks of resistance. Some survived long enough to testify. Because of them, Majdanek speaks. When liberation came, the world saw what the regime had tried to normalize. The shock did not end with the war. It continued into courtrooms, into memorials, into classrooms, and into the ongoing work of remembrance. Majdanek stands today not only as a site of mourning, but as a warning. It teaches that genocide does not begin with camps. It begins with words, with exclusion, with laws that redefine who belongs and who does not, with silence from those who look away. Remembering Majdanek is not about dwelling in darkness. It is about understanding how such darkness was constructed, step by step, so that it can never be constructed again. As we close this chapter, the barracks remain still. The watchtowers cast long shadows. The wind moves across open fields where thousands once stood in roll call. The camp no longer functions, but its lesson does. History does not protect us automatically. Memory must be chosen. Thank you for joining this journey into one of the most documented and undeniable sites of the Holocaust. If this documentary helped you understand not only what happened, but how it happened, consider supporting the channel and continuing to learn. Because places like Majdanek were built by human hands, and the responsibility to remember rests with ours.